Chapter 634. Hua Erlang was indignant and retorted, "Why not? There's a new Jin Dan swordsman in Cloud Lake. He's invincible in Cloud Lake." Before he could finish his sentence, one of the guests who were also drinking next to him shot a sharp glare at him. Immediately, Hua Erlang stopped talking without thinking. In his embarrassment, he grabbed the wine jug and gulped it down. Lu Xiaoyi did not seem to notice. He did not chase after him. The environment here was noisy and it was not a good place to talk about secrets. "Brother Hua, you don't have to say. Since it's a secret, you have to abide by it. When I've been in Cloud Peak for a long time, I'll know. But who is that person? His gaze is fierce? We're talking about the powerful Jin Dan in Cloud Peak, not his wife. Is there a need to be so fierce? Do you want me to teach him a lesson?" Hua Erlang hurriedly stopped him. Having a good relationship with others meant that he would always give in to others. He was not someone who would rush to attack. However, this old brother Fei was a decent person. To stand up for him, even if it was just a sentence, it meant that he had the intention to do so. Just based on this point alone, he was someone worth befriending. At the very least, he would not shrink back in the face of danger. However, shouldn't people usually say we're not talking about his wife when they express their dissatisfaction? What's the difference between talking about his wife or not? He's also a weirdo. "Thank you, Brother Fei. However, it's better not to touch this person for now. He's called Wanderer Feng Hai. He's also a member of Cloud Peak. He has a few friends together, and has some connections. Since we're going to Cloud Peak for sightseeing, it's best not to offend these local tyrants. It's very troublesome." Hua Erlang changed to whispering with his divine sense. It was not good for him to start talking loudly after drinking some wine like he did just now. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. "Brother Hua, you should have mentioned him when you were talking about Foundation establishment heroes. Otherwise, you wouldn't be like now, using this as a pretext to make a fuss." Hua Erlang was disdainful. "Brother Fei, you're still the one who sees things clearly. However, I wasn't deliberately giving him the cold shoulder. With his abilities, he was barely able to settle down on the Cloud Peak. To put it bluntly, he was only able to rely on a few people to stay together and not be chased away. How could he not know what kind of person he was? If I really push him up, will he be able to accept it?" Hua Erlang said that he did not care, but he felt uncomfortable in his heart. It could be heard from his words, but he knew how to control himself. This was the prerequisite for having many friends. "Brother Fei, don't think too much. The swordsman I told you about is the pride of our Cloud Top Loose cultivators." It had been less than 10 years since his debut, but he had killed many people in the Cloud Lake archipelago. Moreover, the ones he killed were all sect disciples. But he had never laid a hand on his fellow itinerant cultivators. There was no one in the Cloud Peak who didn't admire him. Because he did what everyone wanted to do but didn't dare to do. Hence, in the Cloud Peak, everything about this Jin Dan swordsman was taboo. It was for no other reason than to prevent people from coming over to spy on him and secretly set him up. That Wanderer Feng Hai's attitude was indeed bad, but his intentions were not wrong. I was a little too unrestrained just now. However, these things would not be a secret if one day Brother Fei were to gain a foothold in the Cloud Peak and be accepted by the loose cultivator circle. You only need to know that there is such an outstanding person among the swordsmen. As for the rest, let's leave it for the future." Hua Erlang stopped talking about this mysterious swordsman. Lu Xiaoyi did not force him either. Since there was such a person, it was only a matter of time before he would be found. What interested Lu Xiaoyi was not his complicated and bizarre love story, but what Huiji had told him. This was Li Peinan's experience of defeating the perfected Yuanying. If everything was true, he really wanted to see how this swordsman, who had jumped out from the cracks of a rock, could rely on the incomplete inheritance of the Cloud Peak to fight across realms. Could it be that this person was a rare genius? He, Lu Xiaoyi, had cultivated for 300 years and had never once fought across realms. When he was in the Foundation establishment stage, he did not fight with Jin Dan. Now that he was in Jin Dan, He did not think about how to flirt with Yuanying. The death of his senior brother Guang Bei had left a deep impression on him. He was unwilling to touch on the realm of realms. It was said that swordsmen had the ability to fight across realms, but ability was ability, reality was reality. If he was addicted to it, he would lose his life sooner or later. Even in the fifth ring, he had never heard of anyone killing a fifth ring cultivator. Perhaps it was because he was ignorant, or perhaps it was because fifth ring cultivators were all truly powerful. More likely, the more frequently one fought, the more one would understand the true meaning of battle. What was the meaning of fighting across realms? You could only find the weakest and most incompetent upper-level cultivators. What could it prove? It was a habit to be arrogant in front of upper-level cultivators. Thinking that one was someone who could fight across realms was the path to death. Only in a place like the Azure Sky Great World, where battles were not frequent and life and death were not intense, could cultivators prove something by fighting across realms. He was not interested in fighting against a Yuanying stage cultivator, but he was very interested in a Jindan stage cultivator who could compete with a Yuanying stage cultivator. This was not a case of picking the weak, but a correct fighting principle. All battle veterans would not easily set foot in this forbidden area. When you get used to fighting with Yuanying, the Yuanying would no longer see you as Jindan. This was not a good sign. The two of them were full and began to move towards Yunding. Hua Erlang warned. There are clouds and mist lingering on the mountainside of Yunding. In principle, those who are not Jindan cultivators and do not have the right to live on Yunding cannot fly across the clouds and mist and directly ascend the mountain. They have to ascend the mountain from below the clouds and mist before climbing up. Lu Xiaoyi laughed involuntarily. Everyone is staying here temporarily, but there are still so many rules. Hua Erlang said seriously. Brother Fei, don't underestimate the circle of secret practitioners on the cloud peak. Although it looks like a plate of loose sand on the outside, there is still a cohesive force within. Such a big mountain gate, if there are no rules, how can it be maintained? Although this place will never belong to swordsmen in name, we have already stayed here for 10,000 years. Perhaps there will be 10,000 years or even 10,000 years in the future. It is understandable that we treat this place as our home. The rules were set by generations of Jindan loose cultivators and gradually perfected. Although they have never been written down, if you want to stay here, you have to be familiar with every rule. You can't be careless. Lu Xiaoyi nodded and accepted the advice. His heart was filled with emotions. On Yunding on Mount Xiao, he could fly however he wanted. No one had ever restrained him, whether he was a Foundation establishment cultivator or a Jindan cultivator. But in this world of loose cultivators, the rules were stricter than those of the top sections. He did not know if this was an improvement or a regression. In his 300 years of cultivation, he had come into contact with all kinds of cultivators. But most of them were disciples of sects, and they were all elites. Suddenly coming into a group of heroes from the wilderness, there was a sense of novelty. It was also an unusual experience. It might not matter if one was in the Yuanying, but for most of the middle and low-level cultivators, the influence was subtle. This might be the reason why the Cloud-Top Sword Palace chose to give up and leave the Five Rings. When a swordsman faced a blossoming flower realm or an ethereal immortal realm, how could a young swordsman attack without any distractions? If he really unsheathed his sword, would it be compatible with such an environment? Had he become someone who only cared about appearances and no longer cared about the cruelty of reality? The thick layer of clouds on the mountainside added to the domineering atmosphere, but it was like a person wearing a wide and beautiful grass skirt. Could you still see where your feet were? From a practical point of view, the overly thick clouds would also block part of a cultivator's divine sense and all of their vision. In terms of attack and defense, it would imprison them in a disadvantageous situation. If there were enemies, they would be able to approach easily. On this point, the Xianyuan swordsman's principle of finding a mountain gate was very practical. The snowy mountains were cold and endless. When one was in such a place, the first thing one would think of was how to survive. There were no flowers, no ripples, no colorful purples, no sunny days. There was only clarity in the extreme cold, and a glimmer of life under the snow. 4 disciples who had just entered the way of the sword, practicing in these 2 different environments would definitely result in 2 different outcomes. Similarly, the Way Sword Mountain made the same choice. However, they did not choose the extreme cold, but the deathly stillness. This was the difference between the true way of the sword and the way of the sword that was cultivated by the Dharma vein. They were not the same thing. Just like how the sword vein was used to cultivate the Dharma vein, it was also a specious thing. However, as a place to cultivate one's mind, this place was very suitable. It was completely relaxed, just like taking a big pill. The environment could sometimes achieve such an effect. Sometimes, Lu Xiaoyi wondered if those sects that were dedicated to the way of the sword had noticed something because of this. He just strolled around 20,000 feet above the cloud top. As long as he did not enter the pavilions and other places that had owners, no one would bother him. This was because there were many other independent cultivators like him who were strolling around. He had his own plans for his next step. Of course, it was impossible for him to just go down the mountain. If he followed the rules, why did he come here? It was also not suitable for him to go up 25,000 feet. He had not even found the traces of the Li family's son. If he exposed himself so rashly, he would be creating more trouble for himself. It was most suitable to stay on a mountain peak that was about 20,000 feet high. After all, the pavilions only took up a very small area. Most of the scenery was still deep in the mountains, so it was not difficult to find a place to stay. In fact, most of the rogue cultivators who came here to sightsee had this idea. If they ran into someone, they would be considered unlucky. If they didn't run into someone, they would just continue to mingle around like this. Just like that, he wandered around here for several days. He often came into contact with the loose cultivators here, but he never met anyone as easy to talk to as Hua Erlang, so he couldn't get any valuable information out of them. He roughly knew the Li family's son's appearance and characteristics, but on such a large mountain peak, golden core cultivators were all high up in the sky. How could he possibly meet one? He needed to go up stealthily to the highest point of the cloud top. Since this Li Peinan was so impressive, the place where he stayed would definitely not be low. He found a night, and straightened his body. It was as if a star had risen from the peak of the mountain. Night and day did not have much meaning to cultivators. This was theoretical. However, if you were to hang in the sky in broad daylight, you would still be a very obvious target. Lu Xiaoyi's escape technique was very suitable for the night. Furthermore, it was the kind that allowed him to hang in the sky. When he completely indulged himself in the starry sky, the star chart in his body would correspond with the real starry sky. In other people's perception, this was a star. Unless one's cultivation was especially high, their perception was especially sharp, or they had a similar understanding of the stars. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to discover that this thing hanging in the sky was a human trying to spy on them. His speed was very slow. If he was faster, he would turn into a shooting star. What was there to see? Such a swaggering and brazen act was the safest. His body emitted a gentle starlight outwards. Not only did it prevent others from spying on him, it also disguised him well. In this state, he hovered in the sky above the cloud top, quietly feeling the various spiritual waves coming from the peak of the mountain. This was passive reception and not active detection. This was the limit of what he could do now. After all, in a situation where he did not have any advantage in his cultivation, he could only rely on the uniqueness of his technique. Chapter 636. From the top of the mountain, there were all kinds of auras, techniques, power of blood, swordsmanship, and even the aura of Buddhism. This was the time when the sky had just passed. Basically, all the cultivators would take this opportunity to train their cultivation. Then, it was clear who was a Dharma cultivator, swordsman, body cultivator, and Buddhism cultivator. Among them, there were a few auras of sword qi, but Lu Xiaoyi could identify them one by one. He could barely be considered a master of swordsmanship now. He had accumulated a lot of experience in external swordsmanship. When others used a sword, he could easily judge the power of the sword. Through the changes in the sword, he could also accurately judge the level of strength of the opponent. Not everyone had a sword spirit when they were in Jin Dan. They could use the sword box on their back to improve themselves and not show it to others. Flying swords without a sword spirit could only be improved by using their full strength countless times. Therefore, he could sense it clearly from afar. Could it be that someone was deliberately hiding from others and not using their full strength? Theoretically, it was possible, but in reality, it was unrealistic. If they were acting here every day, who would see it? If they did not deceive others, it would affect their own progress in swordsmanship. If they did not use their full strength, they would not be able to achieve their goal of practicing swordsmanship. They would not be able to challenge their own limits. He thought that it would be difficult for others to notice his current state of peeping. There was no yuaning here, and celestial arts were rare. Then could it be that this person was not even above 25,000 feet, but was hiding among the Foundation establishment cultivators? It was very possible. If someone like him dared to stay high above the cloud peak, he would definitely be caught. Lu Xiaoyi turned into a star and floated down. He was not in a hurry. Maybe he was not here, or maybe he was sleeping behind closed doors. He could only wait here passively, hoping that he could sneak into the circle of rogue cultivators to get some important information and meet someone who was as talkative as Hua Erlang. Or, he could only hope that there was accurate news from Heiji. Hopefully, it would not take too much time. On the mountainside of Mount Yunding, there was a stretch of abodes that was less than 1,000 feet above the clouds. At this distance, when there was a storm, the abodes could not be seen from the outside as they were shrouded in a boundless sea of clouds. When the weather was fine and the weather was dry, the abodes could be seen again, just like now. This abode was originally used by the Cloud-Top Sword Palace to entertain guests, and it was of the lowest grade. Hence, it was located at the lowest point and was closest to the Sea of Clouds. Now that the Cloud-Top Sword Palace was occupied by the itinerant cultivators, the only people who were arranged to stay here were the weakest of the itinerant cultivators. The abode was huge, with more than 10 rows of buildings stacked on top of each other. There was no single door or courtyard, and it was more like a dormitory for Taoist children. This was just a metaphor. In fact, every room in the abode was arranged as a set. There was a living room, a bedroom, a study, a dining room, and a quiet room for cultivation. To a mortal, this was already considered a huge living space. There were dozens of itinerant cultivators from all over the Cloud Lake Archipelago living here. Some were from the Cloud Lake Archipelago, some were from the Dalong and Erlang Islands, and there were even some who came from overseas. Those who stayed here for a long time had already cultivated here for more than 10 years. When they gathered together, they were a complete unit. If an outsider came to challenge their residency, they would attack together. This was because everyone understood that as a unit, helping each other was helping themselves. With their low individual abilities, it was extremely difficult for them to protect their residency in the Cloud-Top Sword Palace. It was also because of this that this abode was the most stable group of residents in the Cloud-Top Sword Palace. When those influential people rose like a rocket and fell like a comet, it was this inconspicuous place, which was covered by clouds from time to time, that maintained a shocking stability. Because of this stability, they had children. This was an inevitable product of the lack of entertainment culture. Some couples were cultivators, some were children, and there were even adult men with children. This was the safest place for itinerant cultivators in the Cloud Lake Archipelago. The perfect intensity of spiritual vigor and a quiet environment for cultivation could help children to sense spiritual vigor to the maximum extent. A long brought Ahu to play hide and seek in the mountain rocks and trees outside the abode. Children who grew up in such an environment were always extraordinarily energetic. Playing such games would only be exciting at night. It would be best if this place was covered by clouds. At that time, all the children in the abode would run out, unlike today when there were only the two of them, who were the most mischievous. Ah Long was 12 years old, and Ah Hu was only 9 years old. They were not brothers, but inseparable companions. When the two of them were tired from playing, they lay in the thick grass and looked up at the stars while sharing the snacks that they secretly brought out. This was the happiest stage of life. They were lucky enough to grow up here, and it was like heaven on earth. Look! That star! It's so strange! Ah Hu was the first to discover that something was wrong. They lay here and looked at the stars every day, so they knew the brightest stars in the clouds like the back of their hands. Because they were born in a cultivator family, they knew much more about this than ordinary children. Ah Long discovered it almost at the same time. Yes! It looks like a star that's very close to us. Could it be that the star fell down? The two of them stared at the sky without blinking. Thousands of itinerant cultivators on the cloud-filled peak could not see it, but two children were the first to discover that something was wrong with this star. This sounded ridiculous, but it had its own underlying reason. When cultivators looked at the stars, they rarely stared at them like ordinary people. They relied more on their perception, which was to close their eyes and use their divine sense to distinguish the starlight in the sky. They used the intensity of the starlight to judge the size, distance, and familiarity. This was a conscious way of observing the stars. For those cultivators who did not pay attention to the stars in the sky, the function of their divine sense was to distinguish the fluctuations of spiritual vigor in a certain range around their bodies to determine whether there was danger, so they could not see it. Because the current Lu Xiaoyi was a star, and his whole body was emitting starlight. Divine sense could not touch it, and a more advanced way of observing the world was lacking in the most basic aspects. But the children were different. The only way they could observe the stars in the sky was to look up, not to mention that they did not need to look up now. Lying on the grass, countless stars naturally poured into their eyes. Is it a big bird? Ah Hu asked. It could also be a person. Ah Long looked more carefully. The children's pure eyes easily penetrated Lu Xiaoyi's disguise, which was also a very famous paradox in the cultivation world. The more profound something was, the more likely it was to be broken through by pure eyes, because children did not have so many considerations, artistic conception, and ideas. If it's a person, why did he stop there? Ah Hu was still young after all, so he did not quite understand. It could also be that he wants to do something bad. Ah Long wanted to think more, but obviously he could not think of anything deeper. Shoot it down with a slingshot? Ah Hu proposed the only way he could think of at his age. Chapter 637. The two kids were true to their words. The slingshots were placed behind their waists and the pebbles could be picked up anywhere. This was how they dealt with the small beasts in the mountains. They did not even need to prepare. Both of them pulled their slingshots. Clearly Ah Long, who was stronger, had a bigger slingshot. In an instant, the two pebbles flew into the sky one after the other. Although they had good eyesight, without the support of mana, it was impossible to see the two fast-moving pebbles clearly under the night sky. Even the direction of the pebbles was roughly the same, however, their movements obviously startled the monster. The monster suddenly shook in the sky and then spiraled askew, as if it was injured. This attracted the cheers of the two kids below. The next moment, the monster seemed to have lost its strength and fell down. However, with the eyesight of the two kids, they could not see where it fell to. It seemed very close? It also seemed very far? Could it be in front of the abode? Or behind the abode? Where did it fall to? Behind the mountain? Ah Long was a little confused. No, it's in front of the mountain. I think it's... Ah Hu was also confused, but the principle was very clear. He expressed a different opinion to show that he was different. After all, they were just kids. After a round of laughter, they forgot about it. When the two of them had enough fun and returned to the small square in front of the abode, the adults were just starting to practice. This was a daily routine. Some were immersed in their practice, but there were bound to be some who could not bear the boredom. There were dozens of people, and there were bound to be some who were itching to fight. However, they were all really practicing, and there was never a fight to the death. 2 or a few people participated while the others watched and commented throughout the whole process. It was also a way to improve each other's skills. They were individual cultivators. Without the guidance of the elders, they could only expand themselves in this way. This was also a very important reason why individual cultivators were attracted to the cloud peak. The 2 kids stood at the side from afar, looking at the adults calling the wind and calling the rain. They did not seem to be surprised. This was something they had seen since they were young, and they were already used to it. They could not stay here for long. After a crazy day, sleep would soon find them, and it would mean the end of a fun day. Today's practice ended exceptionally early. The cultivators walked back in 2s and 3s, including the parents of the 2 kids. Xiaolong, go take a bath and sleep. Xiaohu, go drink some water and brush your teeth. This was a normal day, but today, Little Tiger said something extra. Father, Brother Long and I just shot down a big bird in the forest. Brother Long said that it could also be a person. His father laughed and scolded. How did you hit him? With your slingshots? The 2 children loudly expressed their dissatisfaction and explained everything that had happened just now in full detail. The speaker didn't mean anything, but the listener took it seriously. The 2 children might not understand what it meant, but cultivators like them were different. When he looked at the sky again, the moon was bright and the stars were sparse. How could there be any abnormalities? After sending the children away to rest, the group of cultivators began to discuss. I was wondering why I kept feeling that someone was spying on me from the side when I was performing the simulation, but I couldn't find any clues no matter what. So it was actually in the air. With so many Dafa spies spying on us, it's truly inconceivable that we didn't notice a thing. Old Ninth, the technique you practice is also good at perception, but you didn't notice anything at all? Old Geo smiled bitterly. No. If what the children saw was true, then this person's realm is really terrifying. I'm just like you, I have a little intuition, but I don't know where to start and where to look from. Intuition was something that every cultivator would develop in the process of cultivation. It was based on each person's potential and skills. Some were strong and some were weak, and some were real and some were fake. But if there were several people in a group who had the same intuition, then it was basically not wrong. This was also the reason why their simulation ended so hastily. Lu Xiaoi could secretly spy on them from a close distance, but on the path of mysterious intuition, he couldn't completely deceive people. That required a higher realm to achieve. The group of people discussed back and forth, but didn't come up with a plan. What they didn't understand was, if there really was such a degree of spying, then was it targeting the Cloud Peak itinerant cultivators? Or was it just a small area of the abode? If it was targeting the entire Cloud Peak, then naturally it would be handled by the Jin Dan cultivator who lived in the upper level, and it didn't have much to do with them. If it was the latter, then it might be more troublesome. Let's go and ask the human emperor. Although he came the latest, he has traveled extensively. He is the most knowledgeable and the most powerful. Every itinerant cultivator had an awe-inspiring nickname. In this group of people, there were quite a few who were called Saint, Immortal, Venerable, so the nickname of the human emperor wasn't too harsh. This person had come to the abode for less than 10 years. He wasn't old, and he was low-key and steady. He treated people very well, but he was more solitary. He often closed the door and cultivated alone. He rarely participated in everyone's simulation. But in the cultivation world, solitary wasn't a derogatory term. Cultivation was a solitary path, and there were quite a few people like this. Almost half of the dozens of cultivators in the abode were like this. As long as they were willing to stand up when something happened and didn't shrink back, then they were good friends. The group of people quickly arrived outside the room of the human emperor. He had already come out to welcome them. He smiled and listened to everyone's speculations. From what I see, it's just a coincidence. There have always been similar spying in the past few years, and it doesn't seem to have stopped for thousands of years. Everyone just needs to be good to themselves. Actually, there's nothing to worry about. Everyone had the same thought. They came to look for the human emperor just to hear some evidence. The Cloud Peak was the target of public criticism in the Cloud Lake Island. It wasn't a paradise, and they weren't the real owners. They could stay here, but others couldn't? Not to mention the sects and forces of the Cloud Lake Islands, even the wandering cultivators from other provinces would come here to take a look. These people relied on their powerful background and didn't abide by the rules. They deliberately looked at them with scrutinizing eyes, as if to warn them what kind of place this was. They were warning them that they didn't have the right to stay here. After everyone left, the human emperor closed the door, and his eyes revealed a ferocious look. Was there no end to it? He hadn't been out to commit crimes for a long time. He also planned to cultivate from now on and stop killing for the past. Unfortunately, there were always people who didn't let him have his way. In this lifetime, everyone was making things difficult for him. For the time being, he couldn't determine where the threat came from. However, it couldn't escape from the Cloud Lake Islands. The Golden Core cultivators had been beaten to a pulp by him. After beating the younger ones, the older ones would come. He had already seen it once, and there was indeed a difference between them and the Golden Core cultivators. He had used the trick to make them return without any success, but he was afraid that there would not be a next time. He should have left long ago. After Yuanying started to secretly attack. However, he didn't know why he couldn't make up his mind to leave forever. Rationality and emotions were often the opposite. The worst thing was that he couldn't get out of it now. Chapter 638. Lu Shi flew close to the ground and left the sight of the two brats. As for the sway in the air, it was just for fun. Even if it was a mission, he still hoped to have a relaxed attitude, to entertain himself and others. Finding nothing was the result of this night's exploration of the cloud top. This was also within his expectations. After all, this was not a biography. He had coincidentally found two people who were furtively discussing the whereabouts of the Li family's son. If there were, one of them would definitely be the Heavenly Tao and the other could be the School of Novels in Disguise. He was a little uncertain. Did he expose himself during the night exploration? It was just two young children playing around. This should not be the basis for the adult's judgment. But in the cultivation world, the sensitivity of cultivators was completely different from that of the mortal world. Moreover, the individual cultivators finished their simulation in a hurry. With his sharp eyes, he could see that the individual cultivators were afraid of something and were a little distracted. Lu Xiaoyi knew that at least in this residential area, there was no point in spying. If the individual cultivators were really united, there might be rumors of someone exploring the Cloud Peak at night tomorrow. The hope of finding Li Jiazi by himself started to become slim. The next morning, Lu Xiaoyi swaggered to the side of the abode, just like every new Foundation establishment cultivator who lingered on the scenery of the Cloud Peak. Just as he was about to continue approaching the abode, an individual cultivator blocked his way. "Fellow Taoist, please wait. This is a private residence. Visitors are not allowed. The Cloud Peak has countless views. Why do you want to stay here alone?" Lu Xiaoyi smiled naturally. "To be honest, fellow Taoist, the Cloud Peak is indeed very beautiful, but there are not many places for me to stay. I see that the sea of clouds here is vast, but it's quiet and peaceful. I wonder if there are any empty residences that can accept a wandering newcomer?" The cultivator's tone was firm. "I don't have time. You don't have to ask. I can answer you now." Lu Xiaoyi took out a small bag of spirit stones and stuffed it over. "I don't ask for a conclusion. I only ask for an introduction. If I want to settle down here, what are the conditions? When is the most suitable time to visit?" The cultivator took the spirit stone and scanned it with his divine sense. Although he was hesitant, he still couldn't resist the temptation. He wasn't making a decision on his own, he was just pointing the way. "I can't say too much. The so-called conditions are different depending on the community. But now is not the right time. Why don't you try again in 3 months? It's not just this place, It's the same for other places as well. Don't waste your energy. Lu Xiao politely thanked him and did not pester him any further. He went straight down the mountain. The cloud-top loose cultivators were on guard. He had inquired about the basic conditions for loose cultivators to settle down in the cloud top. There were 2 conditions. First, they needed a Jin Dan cultivator as a guarantor. Second, they needed the approval of their neighbors. These 2 conditions sounded easy, but were difficult to fulfill. Those who settled down here were basically poor and had no resources to pave the way. Why would they come here if they were so wealthy? But from today onwards, the trend of accepting newcomers in the cloud top had changed overnight. He had asked several places and used spirit stones to pave the way. The reply he received was that he should come back in a few months. Therefore, there was no need to stay here. The cloud top was vast and winding. If a Jin Dan cultivator made up his mind not to show up, no one could do anything about it. He couldn't wait like a fool. It was difficult to rely on the Water Moon Nunnery to provide accurate information. The nunnery's way of survival was not to fight, but to endure. This made him feel helpless. The Water Moon Nunnery was full of jubilation. Although there were no lanterns or colored banners, the footsteps of people coming and going and the relaxed expressions on their faces told him everything. Most people only knew that the Water Moon Nunnery took in women who cultivated alone, but not many people knew that the Water Moon Nunnery also found a home for female cultivators. It was normal for people to enter and leave. Otherwise, the small nunnery would sooner or later become a shelter for female cultivators in the Cloud Lake archipelago. The Water Moon Nunnery also had its own inheritance system. Basically, it was a master-disciple relationship. The master was an unswerving Buddhist and Taoist, and the disciples were all good people. Of course, there were also some foreign female cultivators who were disillusioned with the mortal world. However, it was difficult for people like the 2 female companions of the Li family who came to the Water Moon Nunnery to seek protection because of their family and personal experiences. They needed to be observed in the nunnery to determine whether they really had no attachment to the prosperity of the outside world. This process would take at least 10 years, and at most decades. Under the confirmation of the elders in the nunnery, they could finally decide who they belonged to. During this process, they had the right to leave at any time, and the Water Moon Nunnery wouldn't stop them. After all, the nunnery only provided them with a quiet environment, and didn't provide them with resources. After staying in the Water Moon Nunnery for a long time and making more friends, they naturally developed feelings for each other. If any of their sisters found a good home, everyone would give them their blessings. Especially for those in the building foundation stage, it was impossible for them to be completely unswerving until they reached immortality. The more they knew about the cultivation world, the more they realized how illusory this so-called immortality was. How could it be so easy to be unswerving until death? Only a few people did. Most people preferred to build a family, have a good environment, and have children and grandchildren. This was the nature of human beings. They were still human beings in the building foundation stage, but they were not immortals yet. Therefore, in the Water Moon Nunnery, the number of people who left was not necessarily less than the number of people who came, which formed a dynamic balance. The Water Moon Nunnery's fighting strength was mediocre, but they could firmly occupy a position in a place as chaotic as the Cloud Lake archipelago, which had a lot to do with their connections. These female cultivators who spread out would all remember the good things about the Water Moon Nunnery, and in the future, their families and friends would gradually have this kind of impression. As a result, in the current Thousand Islands region, many sects and cultivation families could more or less make trouble for the Water Moon Nunnery if they wanted to. As a matter of fact, in the past few days, 2 more sisters found a good home and were going to settle down on an island in the outer sea. As for whether it was the Water Moon Nunnery who pulled the strings or their own luck, no one knew. Anyway, the main family was in a good situation and was also the owner of the island. They liked each other and needed 2 mistresses to increase the number of children. Although they were mistresses, the main wife was an ordinary mortal. Sooner or later, she would be promoted to the main wife, so there was no hurry. The inheritance of a cultivation family was not as simple as that of the mortal world. It was often more difficult for a cultivator to have children than it was for a mortal. The higher the cultivation stage, the more difficult it was. It was even more difficult for a cultivator and a mortal to marry, because the mortal was not affected by the cultivation seed and couldn't fall in position. In the cultivation world, it was normal for males to be abundant and females to be scarce. Female cultivators with the same cultivation stage were still in hot demand, and there weren't many of them in the first place. Excluding those who were determined to cultivate, those who came from sex, and those who had families, there was really not much room for choice. This time, 2 women were marrying the same man, which was very rare. It also showed that the man had to be excellent. Not only did he have to have some strength, but the support of his family was also very important. Chapter 639. The marriage of a cultivator was obviously not as grand as that of the mortal world. They had been through it a few times and were already used to it, so they didn't care about it. Most importantly, Shuiwen nunnery never held it on a grand scale, which was inconsistent with the image of a nunnery. The sisters said goodbye to each other in the nunnery. When the time came, the 2 bhikkhunis walked out of the nunnery alone. When the nunnery door closed, the 2 of them knelt on the ground and cried. A flower carriage drove to the entrance of the nunnery. It was mainly for fun and represented a certain meaning. It was something that all wedding ceremonies had been reduced to the extreme. In fact, it would be done after picking up the people for a short while. For cultivators, it was really sullen to sit in this kind of thing. The driver was a young man. After waiting for a while on the shaft of the carriage, he was a little impatient. Enough! Why are you still doing it? Just cry a few times. It's not like you're going to be separated forever. The 2 women stopped crying when they heard this. Helpless, they didn't say anything and got into the carriage. The flower carriage started and trotted away from Shuiwen nunnery. In the eyes of those who knew about it, they couldn't help but sigh. Another 2 cabbages, oh no, 2 old loofahs, had been taken away. After walking for a few miles and turning a few corners, the buildings of Shuiwen nunnery could no longer be seen. In a small town, the driver returned the flower carriage. At this time, the 2 bhikkhunis had changed their clothes. They were no longer dressed as nihility, but as ordinary women. Clothes made the man. Although they didn't do it deliberately, they were cultivators after all. Time didn't leave too many marks on their faces, even if they were actually not young. Female cultivators all had their own unique secrets in maintaining their appearance. It was as if it was a talent. Sir, are you picking up your family? In addition to the flower carriage, we have other carriages here. They are guaranteed to be comfortable and the price is fair. Boss Che tried to attract business. Just by looking at their clothes, he knew that they weren't ordinary people and had the potential to be big customers. Lu Xiai smiled. Picking up your family, but you insist on going back to your parents' home. It's also troublesome. It's a waste of money and manpower. Don't take the carriage back. Take it as punishment. Boss Che smiled awkwardly. He had such a beautiful and charming wife, but he had to punish her by walking. He didn't know what this person was thinking. Only when he saw the 3 of them slowly rising into the air did he shut his mouth. Since they were cultivators, there was no need to say anything. Saying too much would only invite trouble. After flying for some distance, Lu Xiaoyi took out a bundle of silk from his bosom and handed it to one of the women. Miaoshi, right? Your veil fell on the float. It's yours, right? Miaoshi is the first woman of the Li family. She is nearly 200 years old. She has begun to enter the later years of a laying foundation cultivator. However, she is well maintained. If her purpose is only to marry into a cultivation family to carry on the family line, there is still time. Miaoshi thanked him. Thank you for your care. There are some small things that I have to trouble you with. Lu Xiai smiled. It's no trouble. I just picked up a sand towel and wiped the traces under the float chair. It's a small matter. I'm very careful. I hope I can take good care of you all the way. Otherwise, if Senior Huiji blames me, I can't afford it. The veil was left by Mushi. The traces under the chair were carved by Hein. Their purpose was self-evident. However, under Jean Dan's level of spiritual awareness, there was nothing to hide. Hein was much more shrewish. I didn't expect you to have such a hobby. We sisters were changing clothes in the carriage. I think you saw it clearly? Lu Xiaoyi didn't take it seriously. I saw it clearly. Too clearly. It's just that you changed too quickly. Next time, you can do it slower. I only have such a hobby. I have to trouble you two to cooperate. The two women were speechless. They had no choice but to make this trip. The nunnery asked them to do so. Although the nunnery didn't tell them the reason, they were not stupid. They just wanted to use their appearance to fish out the son of the Li family who had been hiding in the dark. After hundreds of years of resentment, many things had become indifferent. The Shuiwen nunnery wanted to eliminate this potential threat because of its own reasons. As the direct cause and effect, they had to repay the Shuiwen nunnery for protecting them after enjoying the tranquility of the nunnery for decades. However, in their opinion, the son of the Li family didn't deserve to die. Therefore, they left traces along the way, hoping that this person would know the danger and leave on his own. This was a muddled account, an old account. Originally, with the identity of cultivators and their attitude towards life, those past events could be dismissed with a laugh. There were no winners here, everyone was a loser. However, there were bigots everywhere, and Li Peinan was one of them. If everyone knew when to advance and retreat, if they knew how to tolerate and forgive, this world of cultivation would be a paradise on earth. How could there be disputes? Was it possible? They were contradictory. They had thought that they had gotten away from right and wrong, but they didn't expect that the resentment from hundreds of years ago still wouldn't let them go. Even though they were old, they still had to face the embarrassing things when they were young. In this crisis that had been delayed for hundreds of years, they had been passively enduring it, hoping that time could erase everything. They could consider the problem in this way, but the Shuiwen nunnery couldn't. How could they bear to let this hidden danger spy on the nunnery at any time? Everyone had to be on tenterhooks when they went out. The nunnery couldn't come up with this idea. It required a deep understanding of the son of the Li family's character, which hit the nail on the head. Based on their understanding of the son of the Li family, he would definitely come even if he knew it was dangerous. The only thing they felt strange about was why this person in front of them thought that he alone could take down the son of the Li family, who was no longer what he used to be. In the past 10 years, Li Peinan had made a name for himself in the Cloud Lake Islands. This wasn't the flattery between the individual cultivators, but because there were countless bloody battles. As long as one understood that there was a Yuanying master in the Cloud Lake Islands, one could understand that the Jing Dan here couldn't find a match for the son of the Li family. According to their perception, this person was only in the Foundation establishment realm. This was definitely an illusion. It should be the appearance of a gold core realm cultivator who had restrained his aura. However, he was definitely not a nascent soul realm cultivator. A nascent soul realm cultivator had captured a gold core realm cultivator, and in such a brazen manner. If word got out, people would laugh at him. The way a real nascent soul realm cultivator did things was to come in the blink of an eye. Miaoshi said hesitantly. Changjin, are you from the Xianyuan? It wasn't difficult to make such a guess. In the Azure Sky big world, only Xianyuan could play with swords, and only they could look down on all the individual swordsmen. No matter how famous you were or how glorious your battle record was, it was nothing in their eyes. Lu Xiaoyi nodded politely. Yes, I'm from the Xianyuan. Why, do you two have anything to say? Hein had a straightforward temper. The Xianyuan now is not the Xianyuan of the past. In the cultivation world, strength speaks, especially in the Thousand Islands region. No one cares how big your background is. What we want to say is that we've already cooperated with Shangjin's acting. Don't lose face if you're not strong enough and can't catch him. This will be endless trouble, and everyone will be in trouble. Chapter 640. The three of them kept flying out according to the plan, even though they knew it was just an act. They knew that Li Jiazi would not be stupid enough to believe it. They were just looking for a place to solve the problem, so they had to continue the act. They flew all the way without covering their tracks. 5 days later, they arrived at a deserted island in the sea. It was pitifully small, with only a few miles of diameter. It was densely covered with rocks and not even a blade of grass grew. There was a small sea god temple on the island, which was built by mortals to pray for safety. There was no one in charge, and it was only for passing merchant sailors to pray for blessings. Such sea god temples were very common in the Thousand Islands region. Although not every island had one, there were at least half of them. They represented the longing of seafarers. Lu Xiaoyi felt that this place was very suitable. It was meaningless to fly out again, so he said with a smile, "I think this place is very good. It's quiet enough. If Li Jiazi doesn't come, it's not bad to have two beauties as companions to establish a family and have children." The two women curled their lips and landed on the ground. They could see that this so-called Xianyuan swordsman was probably not a decent person. He had not taken enough advantage of them. How could he have the demeanor of a major sect? "If Li Peinan doesn't come, do we have to wait forever?" Miaoshi asked. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. "He will come. You are the source of his resentment. If he can't let go of this resentment and untie this knot in his heart, he will never be able to make progress. Therefore, he must come. Not for you, but for himself. Will you kill him?" Haiyan was a little worried. Lu Xiaoyi asked back, "Maybe I'll be the one to die. In that case, Great Swordsman Li's name will be even more famous in the Thousand Islands region. He doesn't deserve to die." Haiyan was very serious. Although they no longer had the feelings of the past, it did not mean that she could not express her opinion. Lu Xiaoyi was also very serious. "Those people he killed deserve to die? Don't talk about whether they deserve to die or not. It's meaningless to talk about it in the cultivation world. You can't ignore other people's lives just because you encountered something when you were young. You can't take it for granted. You killed people and your heart calmed down, but what about others? Were they born to calm you down? No one had the right to judge whether other people's lives should exist or not. You can kill him, but you can't determine his fate. This is the essence of cultivation. It's only the size of a fist that matters." The three of them sat down. The structure of the sea god temple was not bad. Although very few people came here, it was still very clean. In the environment where the sea breeze rippled, there was very little dust. The main consideration of the building was the problem of moisture resistance. "Tell me about yourselves. In my ears I heard the story of a young man being abandoned. This is the version that has been passed around, but I know that it is not true. As the person involved, you have the right to speak. By the way, what you say may have an impact on how we deal with him." Lu Xiaoyi was not a person who liked to pry into other people's secrets, because he believed that this was the source of trouble. But the night was long, how could he pass the time? Even if he didn't want to hear it, there would definitely be others who wanted to hear it. The two women sighed. They also didn't want to talk about it. Why should they reopen the dusty memories and hurt themselves? But they still wanted to use this story to tell the visitors from Xianyuan that Li Jiazi was never a murderous maniac with evil deeds. They wanted him to stay away from their lives, but they didn't want him to die. These were two different things. "He is almost 100 years older than me, so the rumor that we were childhood sweethearts is actually not accurate." Miaoshi began her story. "When he was a rogue cultivator, he was wandering overseas. When he was seriously injured, I saved him. But he probably didn't understand that saving him didn't mean that I liked him, and we had to become cultivation companions. This is different. Maybe it was because I was in a good mood at that time." Haiyan's version of the story was also not quite the same as the rumor. Time passed as the two women talked endlessly. Lu Xiaoyi was sleepy, but he had to be alert. Without a good listener, there wouldn't be a good story. "Don't bully a poor young man." This was his catchphrase. The most terrible thing was that not only did he think this way, but he also did this way. I just want to live a good life. I don't want to be with a lunatic. He is too self-righteous. You can't be bad to him. He will take revenge. You can't be good to him either, because he thinks you are his. His second catchphrase was, "My life is in my own hands, not in the hands of the heavens." For others, this was just a slogan to motivate themselves, but he took it seriously. You can imagine the pressure of being with a person who is full of such thoughts. I want a more stable environment for cultivation. Is that wrong? I want to enjoy my life more freely. Is that wrong? I don't want to be on the run every day. I don't want to live in bloodshed. Is that too much to ask? He thinks that you betrayed him and betrayed his ideals. That's his dream, not mine. You can't lose my own thoughts and become a vassal just because we are together. Everything I do is based on him. He hates dual cultivation the most. But he doesn't need it, but I do. Even if he occasionally dual cultivates, it is like he is practicing his sword. How many times does he strike with his sword? He doesn't want to do it for even a second longer. He doesn't want to do it for even a second longer. He is just a tool. Lu Xiaoyi felt like his head was about to explode. In short, he is a child who will never grow up. Is the world black and white? The two women nodded in unison. In Watermoon Nunnery, when he came to find you. Were you deliberately acting like that for him to see? Your purpose was nothing more than to cut off his thoughts, wasn't it? At their age, the two women didn't care about face, so they nodded in response. He just wanted to prove in front of you that he was right, and you were all wrong. And you just didn't want to give him such a chance? Lu Xiaoyi continued to ask. The two women said in unison, "Why? We have our own lives. Whether it is good or bad, we have to bear it ourselves. We don't need other people to be our life teachers. He has formed his gold core now and has great power, but he isn't happy. We are doing what we like in Watermoon Nunnery. We are very happy. We don't think our lives are worse than others." Lu Xiaoyi heaved a long sigh, but his next words confused the two women. You heard it clearly, right? You just have to live your own lives. Don't think of yourself as a savior. You can't save anyone but yourself. An even deeper sigh came from outside the Sea God Palace. I never thought of saving anyone. I just wanted to prove that the only son of the Li clan wasn't a good-for-nothing who relied on his clan's power to survive. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. Do you still want to take anyone with you now? The voice outside the window said. No need. Thank you for letting me know what I am in their eyes. Although it's very disappointing, it's also a relief. Lu Xiaoyi said softly. If you don't take them, I will take you. How could other people's knowledge compare to their own personal experience? This was a quality that an outstanding alchemist must have. Therefore, the first thing he considered was whether or not his tribulation was here. Then there was Jean Dan. Did this mean that his danger came from the challenge of a lower-level Jean Dan cultivator? The possibility of this was not high, because he wasn't too keen on fighting. Why would he find trouble with a Jean Dan cultivator? However, a few years later, one of his most cherished disciples was killed in the wild. That was a successor that he had spent countless time and resources to cultivate. How could he not be heartbroken when it was destroyed by the hands of a rogue cultivator? His sect was a medium-sized sect, and there were only a few perfected Yuanian cultivators. They were all outside the universe collecting spiritual opportunity, and he was the only Yuanian patriarch guarding the sect. Because he focused on alchemy, he was weaker in other aspects, including combat and the ability to deal with complicated matters. In the end, under the instigation of the other sects, the other perfected Yuanian cultivators all kept their cool, but he, the old master, was the only one who was provoked. That was why he made the first move to kill. However, he was not stupid. He knew that in the divination, there was a possibility that Jean Dan might be his opponent, so he acted very carefully. This was also the reason why Li Peinan was able to scare him away as soon as he used his trump card. However, he was a Yuanying perfected Yuanying cultivator after all. After he went back and thought about it, he finally figured out that Jin Dan's trump card could indeed hurt him, but it was not Jin Dan's true strength. Furthermore, such a trump card might not be used again. His lack of combat experience and his worry about the divination caused him to miss a good opportunity and make a fool of himself. This was what he judged after the fact. In fact, he did not make a wrong judgment. Therefore, he came here to reorganize his Tao heart and to regain his lost reputation. Most importantly, Yuanying was Yuanying, and Jin Dan was Jin Dan. Since when was it the turn of a rogue cultivator to fight against cultivators of a higher level? Yuanying was afraid of Jin Dan. It was a problem with his alchemy. If he really had such an attitude, how could he improve in the future? He felt that he was a little paranoid. If he had known that this would be the result, he would not have done that divination. He had tied himself down and caused so much trouble for no reason. Chapter 642. Looking at his friends who were lying on the ground, unable to get up, Li Peinan's heart was set ablaze. That was his personality. My life is in my own hands, not the heavens. In the previous battle with Master Jingqin, the trump card that turned the tables came from the ancient place where he learned his skills. It was a powerful sword plate. In the inheritance of the sword vein, people were already used to the inner sword's sword pellet and the outer sword's sword box's flying sword. In fact, swordsmen had other ways of storing swords, for example, the sword plate. The sword pellet was hidden in a cultivator's sea of consciousness, while the flying sword was kept in the sword box on the cultivator's back. The sword plate was in between the two. It coiled up the flying sword like a soft sword, and then placed it in the middle dantian to be nourished and released to kill. It was exceptionally sharp. Compared to the sword box in the sword vein, it was hard to say whether the flying sword in the sword box was more powerful. Or was the flying sword in the sword plate more powerful? Anyway, based on his personal experience, he carried both the sword box and the sword plate. In comparison, there was no difference between the two. In terms of power, the sword plate was heavier because it was nourished in the middle dantian where mana gathered. In terms of agility, the flying sword in the sword box was more flexible. But there were two advantages. The flying sword in the sword box was not as good as the sword plate. First, it was concealed. Without the sword box, there was no need to carry it all the time. It was invisible like the sword pellet, and could be anywhere at any time without being disturbed. Second, it was preserved. The sword plate could be passed down through generations, unlike the flying sword in the sword box which had to be cultivated by oneself. It was useless to take other people's flying sword and could not be controlled. The sword plate could be passed down from master to disciple, and from disciple to disciple, but whether or not it could release its greatest power was another matter. In the secret place he entered, there was such a sword plate. After 100 years of hard work, he finally kept it in his dantian, and it became his greatest weapon in battle. However, although this thing was very powerful, it was a one-time attack. In other words, with his current cultivation, it would take him several days to fill up the sword disc. Moreover, it would only release one sword. If it couldn't kill anyone, it would become a useless disc. He would need to store it in his dantian again to store energy for several days. It was equivalent to a treasure that could only be used once every few days. Wizard Jingqin had seen through this, which was why he dared to come looking for him without fear. He judged that he only had the ability to wield an axe, and would not be able to continue after that. This was the double-edged sword left behind by a great cultivator. It had benefits, but it also had helplessness. It was impossible for him to move unhindered in the cultivation world with it, because this was not his true strength. Only when he reached the Yuanying stage could he truly unleash the power of the sword disc. But when he reached the Yuanying stage, his flying sword and sword disc would naturally have a qualitative improvement. At that time, they might not be much inferior to this sword disc. Right now, he was only using this ability in advance, and it was a one-time use. In the cultivation world, there was no such thing as a free lunch. Using power that was beyond one's ability would definitely have some kind of restriction, and it would not be a reckless squandering. In terms of effect, this sword disc of his was already very abnormal. It made it difficult for him to find a worthy opponent in the Jin Dan group. In fact, in terms of cultivation, vision, experience, and overall, he had not reached the stage where he could see all the mountains and small mountains. He did not have any advantage over those disciples of the sect. His success lay in that sword disc. Striking out a sword amidst the crisscrossing sword light, a sword with a power that was poles apart from his own ability, would not give the opponent any time to react, and he would succeed in one strike. Because it was also a sword disc, no one would think too much about it. They would only think that this was the power of his flying sword. Therefore, the only sword that could possibly threaten the enlightened Yuanying was the ancient sword disc. If it was another opponent, he would look for an opportunity to use it during the battle. But when his opponent was a Yuanying like Wizard Jingqin, what was the need for him to use other methods? It could not be used to attack or defend. When the ultimate move lost its suddenness and concealment, its effect would naturally be greatly reduced. The opponent would have countless ways to deal with it. He was hesitating, unable to find the most suitable time to use his sword. Wizard Jingqin, who was in the sky, did not give him much time to think. Under the shroud of spiritual pressure, a huge medicine bowl flew towards him. It was neither fast nor slow, as if it was giving him a chance to use his sword. He was an alchemist, so he was most familiar with the things he used to refine medicine. It looked funny and clumsy, but it was actually very stable. When it attacked, it could suppress 1,000 caddies. When it defended, it could not be penetrated by wind or rain. It was perfect for single-target physical attacks like flying swords. Wizard Jingqin did not go easy on him at all. As a veteran Yuanying enlightened master, even if he was not good at fighting, he still had some basic fighting skills. With his old friend's divination, he would not be careless and take the risk to underestimate his opponent. Li Peinan was determined. Even if the opportunity to use his sword was limited, he must use his sword. Even if he knew that the effect of using his sword was limited, it was still better than being caught without a fight. If he was not caught, he and his friends would not be lucky today. Just like what Jingqin said, everyone who saw it must die. Not only them, but also the 2 women in the sea goddess palace that he could not forget, and the unknown cultivator who lured him here. He shouted. He did not put down his sword box flying swords that were like embroidery needles in front of Yuanying enlightened master. Instead, he gathered all his magic power in his dantian. When the magic power in his dantian was activated to the maximum, he exploded. A ray of white light was spat out from his mouth. It was like lightning, flying towards Wizard Jingqin. Even the spiritual pressure of Yuanying enlightened master could not stop it at all. At the same time he used his sword, Li Peinan felt all the hair on his body stand up, as if the god of death had just passed by him. He was very confused. Wizard Jingqin was obviously defending against his sword box at the moment, and did not have time to deal with him. What was with this sudden feeling of death? Could it be that this was Jingqin's scheme, luring him to use his sword while harming him? When did Jingqin, who was outstanding in alchemy, have such a brilliant tactical ability? But he quickly realized that he was wrong. The danger of death came from behind, from the sea goddess palace. It was a very strange-looking flying sword. It had an irregular sawtooth shape, and its entire body was grayish-black. It flew without a sound, and its aura was not obvious. If this thing had not brushed past his neck, he would not have discovered its existence. After flying slightly further, he could clearly see this strange-looking flying sword with his eyes, but he could not sense it at all with his divine sense. This thing was actually an absolute god. Li Peinan's sword box shone brightly. Even the starlight in the sky could not hide its brilliance, as if it was the only thing in the world. The rogue cultivators lying on the ground looked at this sword nervously, because this would determine their life and death. If it succeeded, they would live; if it failed, they would die. There was no third possibility. Jingqin's medicine bowl suddenly expanded, from the original size of a person to the size of a mountain. It completely sealed the sword box's possible changes in sword path. In such a short distance, it was impossible to go around the medicine bowl's sword path, so they could only crash into it. Amidst the loud noise, the sword box and medicine bowl collided and cut, creating a teeth-numbing sound of metal scraping, accompanied by an almost inaudible groan. Chapter 643. Before the crowd could react to this brief collision, 6 rays of light shot out from the Sea Deity Hall, as fast as lightning. Following that, a figure flashed out from the hall, shooting straight into the 9 heavens. Under the starry sky, 7 rays of light formed the standard Big Dipper formation. Flying swords swooped down one after another, without the sound of swords whistling; only the light of swords could be seen. After a few breaths, the Big Dipper formation seemed to have disappeared, leaving only the starlight that filled the sky, becoming a part of the stellar sword formation. In the night sky, it was filled with killing intent. Master Jingqin was greatly shocked. His old friend's prophecy had been completely revealed, saying that he might die in the hands of Jin Dan. One could not blame the fortune-teller for being vague. The answer to the riddle of a divination would not be directly stated, but would at least give 2 or more answers. His old friend's prophecy was already very direct, but because of this, he did not last for more than a few days. His judgment was not wrong; this Li Jiazi was indeed not a threat to his life. However, the problem was that he had missed out on an extremely important person, the mysterious person who lured Li Jiazi out. Knowing that Li Jiazi's strength was outstanding in Jin Dan, he still dared to lure him out alone. This in itself meant something. Unfortunately, despite all his calculations, he had missed out on the most important part. He had been injured from the very beginning, and it was an extremely serious injury. Hidden under Li Jiazi's mighty sword plate was a sinister sword of the dark night. With the sword plate's concealment, it was completely silent. Even Yuanning's divine sense, which he relied on, could not help him. By the time he realized that the sneak attack was coming, it was already too late for him to dodge. His most powerful medicine bowl was still clashing with the sword disc. Apart from the limited number of protective shields he didn't have any other means that he could use. He didn't have enough combat experience, and as a non-combat cultivator, he was somewhat powerless in such a sudden change. Once the sword of the Dark Night entered his body, it was as if lightning had struck him. His entire body felt as if it had been struck by lightning, and the devastating sword energy rampaged through his body, instantly breaking the normal flow of mana in his body. Although the sword plate's attack had been blocked, the sword formation that followed caused the heavily injured him to run for his life. All of this happened in the short span of 2 to 3 breaths. Yuanning's body was obviously different from Jin Dan's. Under the full force of Lu Xiaoyi's hidden fragrance, if it had been Jin Dan, he would have died long ago. However, Jingqin was still able to barely hold on. As an alchemist, he had an unimaginable level of attainment in the use of great medicines and body functions. At this moment, he no longer had the heart to continue fighting. The fear of the prophecy made him understand that he was really in a race against death. His only thought was to leave this place and never come back. This was a taboo when facing a swordsman. If he wanted to leave, he had to strike back first. As a genuine Yuanning spiritual master, he was still at an advantage in terms of magic power and cultivation, even though he was severely injured. He fought back with all his might, preventing his opponent's stellar sword formation from taking shape. Only then would he have the opportunity to retreat. They all knew the logic, but how many of them could do it when they were truly faced with life and death? It was a common phenomenon to talk about strategies on paper. Only those who were the most experienced in battles and grew up in bloody and cruel situations would be able to understand and make the most accurate choice in the blink of an eye. Alchemists lacked battle experience. Prophecies could shake one's heart. When Master Jingqin realized that he could not use spiritual pressure to suppress his opponent, the outcome was already decided. I have no enmity with Xian Yuan. Why do you want to kill me? Master Jingqin shouted in despair. Killing you is a small karma. Not killing you is a big karma. Lu Shi was unmoved. The sword light that came down from the sword formation was only the prelude to the sword formation's ultimate attack. It was to cause him to be flustered and lose his footing. The slightest opening caused the 7 stars sword formation to tremble. Even the countless stars in the sky dimmed in an instant. The city wall came crashing down. A magnificent celestial phenomenon was born out of thin air. The golden Corlus cultivators below were dazzled by this scene. From the moment Li Peinan attacked until now, not even 3 breaths had passed. The famous Master Jingqin of the Cloud Lake Archipelago had died on the island. It was just like his old friend's prophecy. Who knew that such a prophecy was good to listen to? Or was it better not to listen to it? Lu Xi slowly kept his sword. He did not even look at the scattered bodies on the ground. He only looked at Li Peinan, who was standing there in a daze. Li Peinan was a little unable to bear such pressure. He was very clear that if he had to choose an opponent, he would rather choose Master Jingqin than this swordsman who was also in the Jin Dan realm. Against Master Jingqin, he had a lot of battle experience to rely on. However, the person in front of him was different. He was more experienced than him, and had killed more people. He unconsciously opened his mouth to relieve the pressure. You killed him! Lu Xiao played it down. His name is not good. He faced the Sea God Palace. Come out. Since you are leaving, I am a soft-hearted person. I will allow you to have a farewell ceremony. Mushi and Hein walked out with their hands and feet weak. With their knowledge, they could not understand what was happening outside. They only knew that one of the giants in the Cloud Lake had died here. It seemed that there was no room for struggle. Li Peinan's mouth was dry. He had lost the power of the sword plate. He was like a piece of meat on the chopping board. No matter how arrogant he was, he could not say that his life was in his own hands. Limited by his age, he could not say that even if he was poor. This made him feel very aggrieved. Aren't you here to kill me? Lu Xiao said indifferently. There are many ways to solve problems. Killing is not the only way. Besides, today's killing mood is over. Follow me first. I will think of how to deal with you. Li Peinan smiled sadly. Are we going to Shao Mountain? It doesn't matter. I can't stay in the Cloud Lake Archipelago any longer. I owe you my life. You can do whatever you want. Lu Xiao hovered in the air and looked at the busy scene below. Li Peinan was busy taking care of his Jin Dan friends. He was taking medicine and guiding Qi. The 2 girls were helping at the side. They cooperated very well. Wasn't it better to do this earlier? So many insignificant things happened. He had to make a trip so far away. He had to kill Jingqin. This came from a cultivator's deep judgment of the situation. He was not harmless just because he was an alchemist. It was not good to fight with others. This had nothing to do with kindness or evil. Just as Jingqin said, killing them was a small karma. Missing a few would be a big karma. Not only Li Peinan and his friends, but also the 3 people in the Sea God Palace. This was the choice of those who sought Tao. Although Jingqin was not good at fighting, his direction was right. Since they were going to face each other sooner or later, it was better to strike first. When Master Jingqin finished dealing with the Jin Dan outside and started fighting with him, the Xianyuan swordsman, the situation would be completely different. He would not have the chance to sneak attack anymore. He would not be in a state of mental imbalance. When a Yuanying perfected person was frightened by the might of a Xianyuan swordsman and started to fight with him wholeheartedly, he did not know what his chances of winning were. It was impossible to kill him quickly. Once they were in a stalemate, the difference between their cultivation levels would become the deciding factor of the battle. He was a small pond, the other was a big lake. There was no comparison. Chapter 644. Lu Xiaoyi did not kill Li Jiazi, not because he was soft-hearted, but because when he received the mission from Nanjunren, he could vaguely understand Junren's thoughts. This mission was to solve the problem first. As for how many people the swordsman killed, it was not a crime to Xianyuan. The origin of the disciples of Mount E was very complicated, including a wide range of regions. Basically, there were people who admired them in all 7 continents. Mount E would also recruit disciples from these places at fixed times to expand the number of students. This was the current situation of Qing Kong, which was completely different from 10,000 years ago. In fact, the Dharma branch would also recruit disciples from the North region, and Mount E would also let it be. Even in the North region, which was a sword-oriented place, there were good Dharma branches. Similarly, even in the East Sea and South Sea, where the Dharma branch originated from, there were also people who admired swords wholeheartedly. This was the natural curiosity of humans. Among all the disciples from other continents in Mount E, the one with the highest quantity and the highest quality was the Thousand Islands region. Because the Cloud-Top Sword Palace had cultivated for tens of thousands of years, the trend of learning swords, especially around the Cloud Lake archipelago, had lasted for a long time. Of course, a place like this that produced excellent disciples could not be casually sent to show off. Moreover, the one who killed was the Jindan swordsman, which was a rogue cultivator. If it fell into the mouth of people with bad intentions, it would be a joke and affect the recruitment of Mount E. This was for the public. For the sake of privacy, Lu Xiaoyi also made a small discovery. The moment Li Jiazi used all his strength to attack the sword plate, the intercepting Fate Ball in his mind clearly captured a trace of Fate Ball in Li Jiazi's sea of consciousness. This was also a person who was favored by Fate Ball. No wonder he could become a Jindan in just a short 100 years and become so powerful. He must have obtained a great opportunity. Lu Xiaoyi was no longer the same as before. When he saw other people with Fate Balls, he was tempted. In fact, until now, he had let go of Fate Balls many times. On Whirling Star, on Jishio, not to mention on the grassland, there was still a large amount of Fate Balls waiting for him to harvest. He really did not care about Li Peinan's Fate Ball. Instead, what made him more curious was that he wanted to observe the growth path of a person who carried Fate Balls closely. How was it different from others? As the saying goes, it's hard for him to make a fair and objective evaluation of his own achievements. However, he could treat others equally. This was the reason why he brought Li Jiazi with him, and eventually brought him to Mount Shao. Of course, there were some other reasons as well. This person was very talented in the way of the sword and had an interesting sword set. However, his state of mind was not completely mature. Mount E needed such a strong person to join, and so on. The bustle below had finally come to an end. A few Jindan members supported each other, and bowed to the swordsman in the sky. The sensible ones swore that they would not divulge today's matter before setting up the flying boat and returning to the Cloud Peak. Don't you have anything to say to each other? I'll give you a chance to clear things up, but you can't go after me. I don't have the time to travel thousands of miles to deal with your trivial matters, Hein said straightforwardly. There's nothing to say. It should have been over 100 years ago, but it's been delayed until now. Even 2 small foundation-building cultivators like us can let it go, but a Jindan like him can't let it go. We just want to live a quiet life and not be disturbed by others, no matter whether you have bad intentions or good intentions. Lu Xiaoyi turned to look at Li Peinan, but he still turned his head away. From now on, we'll have nothing to do with each other. Miaoshi snorted. We've never been together, so why do we have to break up? Shangjun, if there's nothing else, we're leaving. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. Are we still going back to Shuiwen Nunnery? Miaoshi sighed. We can't go back. This matter also made us see clearly that there is no absolutely safe and quiet place in the world. So what if we go back to Shuiwen Nunnery? In the future, there will definitely be people investigating Master Jingqin's death in Cloud Lake. Can we hide? And then be sent out by Shuiwen Nunnery? Life and death, just like this time? We'll go to Incineration Island and hope to have a quiet old age. The two women bowed again, jumped up, and disappeared into the night. It's a very smart choice. As two opposing groups in the Thousand Islands region, the Cloud Lake archipelago can't reach the Incineration Island. The two female Juji cultivators in their twilight years won't arouse any suspicion. It's a good choice. Lu Xiaoi looked at the backs of the two women and said meaningfully, "You see, maybe you have good intentions. But why do your good intentions always bring harm to others? Why do you still have to hide when you're in your twilight years?" The two women jumped up, and one after the other, they also disappeared into the boundless sea. "Your sword plate is very interesting. Did you get it from exploring?" Flying in loneliness, Lu Xiaoi started a conversation. Li Peinan didn't dare not to answer. "Yes. When I was in the Jiji realm, I was hanging around in the outer sea, doing some business without capital. Once, I was chased by someone and had no choice but to hide in a volcano on a deserted island due to serious injuries. Then, I had some fated chances." Lu Xiaoi sighed. This was exactly the template of a protagonist. Other people jumped into a volcano and had fated chances, but he was swallowed by a sea beast and had nothing. It was too unfair. Li Peinan thought for a moment, and felt that in her current situation, she should express her gratitude to this Xianyuan swordsman. Swordsmen definitely wouldn't care about spirit stones and resources, and swordsmen didn't care about these things. What a swordsman cared about was, "That island is actually not too far away from here, and it's not a detour. If you're interested, I can take you to have a look." Lu Xiaoi smiled. "I'm a little tempted. But the sword plate is very different. I think no swordsman can resist this temptation. This is your fated chance. If I go and have a look, it won't affect you, right?" Li Peinan complained in her heart. "If you're so upright, don't open your mouth. It won't affect me. No matter what, you've saved my life, so it's only right for me to repay you. Moreover, I've already taken away all the fated chances in that place, such as the sword plate. The rest are things that I can't take away. If you go, then it'll be your fated chance. You're quite good with words." Lu Xiaoi smiled with satisfaction. "If that's the case, I'll make a trip there. I really want to know what the third vein of the sword vein is, other than the inner and outer veins." He wasn't lying. Swordsmen didn't care about other external things. This was the truth. But there would always be something that would move them. To Lu Xiaoi, he was now facing a very urgent problem. The scene of the Baoang slope in the sword case was about to be used up by him. After he successfully formed his core, his 7 sword spirits started to improve greatly under the support of his more refined magic power and spirit. The fastest to improve were Big Dipper and Four Seasons Execution City. They had already broken through the 90th level and were not far away from the 99th level of the Baoang slope. It could be believed that in a few years, they would face the awkward situation of not having a suitable scene to improve their sword spirits. The other sword spirits had also broken through the 80th level and were close at hand to break through the 90th level. This was a problem that needed to be solved urgently, but he didn't have a concrete method now. Remodeling the sword case was the most realistic, but it was limited by the materials. Secondly, he had always been brooding over the fact that he couldn't use his sword in the stomach of the sea beast. If he didn't solve this problem, there would be limited meaning in making a sword case with more levels. The sword plate allowed him to see another direction. So even if he was never a person who liked to explore mysteries, he couldn't help but want to find out. Chapter 645. The two of them discussed the sword plate along the way as they approached the deserted island. This was a very small, desolate island with a radius of 1,000 feet. It was basically covered by volcanic rocks. The entire island was in the shape of a volcano. In terms of size, there were thousands of such small islands in the Thousand Islands region. There wasn't even a space to build a sea god temple. It was obvious how remote this place was. White smoke could be faintly seen coming out of the volcano. This meant that this was an active volcano that was still in the eruption period. As for when it would erupt, only the heavens knew. "You're quite brave. You dared to dive into such a volcano?" Lu Xiaoyi joked. Li Peinan told the truth. "It's not that I'm brave, but there was no other way. There was no road to heaven and no door to the earth. Only by diving into such a dangerous volcano could there be a way to survive. If I changed to a safer place, I would definitely be found. However, after this disciple went in, I found that this volcano was not as active as I thought. The temperature inside was not high either. Cultivators can completely endure it. There should be magma flowing below, creating the illusion of an eruption." Lu Xiaoyi nodded. He circled around the island and felt the balance of the 5 elements on the deserted island. As Li Peinan said, the 5 elements were very stable and balanced. It was not the chaotic state before the crack appeared. This judgment could be made as long as one had a little understanding of the 5 elements. From this, he knew that the people who chased after this Li family's son were also insignificant cultivators. Otherwise, he would not have been able to escape. People with luck were always luckier. "Lead the way, let's go in." Li Peinan was in front, and he was behind. One after the other, they entered the volcano. Lu Xiaoyi had overcome his fear of caves through his own efforts. With his current earth escape ability, this kind of terrain could not trap him, so he was not afraid of any possible traps. Li Peinan was very careful in front. He stopped from time to judge and apologize. "I haven't been here for more than 100 years. There may be some small changes. We have to be careful. There is no true cultivation array here, nor is there any fluctuation of spiritual vigor. It is purely set up by the methods of the mortal world, so if a cultivator uses their divine sense to investigate, they won't find anything. The reason why I was able to escape back then was because of the special structure here." Lu Xiaoyi nodded. "It's a careful arrangement. However, there's also a problem. If one day the earth really cracks, this arrangement won't have any protective power, and the inheritance will disappear. Or is there someone who can predict the geological changes of tens of thousands of years?" Li Peinan agreed. "The person who set it up probably didn't intend to preserve it for so long. It's just that the stratum of this sea has been stable for tens of thousands of years. It's just a coincidence." The two of them went all the way down, sometimes squeezing through the crevices of the rocks. After a while, they came to the side of a big rock. Based on their senses, they were already 1,000 feet below the sea level. However, the surrounding environment was not very humid, and the airtight environment was very good. "There's a hidden mechanism here. I've already dismantled the trap. I don't know if anyone else has come here in the past 100 years. Li Peinan was standing at the side. He did it very slowly so that the swordsman behind him could see more clearly. When it came to secret exploration, there were countless rules. If you don't want to trick others, you must show your actions clearly to your companions. Don't hold on to the idea that only you can know your secrets. Otherwise, people will think the wrong way. The Xianyuan swordsman had been carefree ever since he came down. However, the more he behaved like this, the more careful Li Peinan was, because this meant that this person had his own unique skills. Exploration was a skill that almost every cultivator, whether they were individual cultivators or cultivators from sects, involved in all aspects. Of course, he didn't know that Lu Xiaoyi was really a layman when it came to these things. He had never had such an experience before. When the big rock fell, Li Peinan specifically warned, "Don't use brute force on this rock. I think that if you use brute force to break it open, it will cause seawater to pour in." Behind the big rock was a small stone room. Looking deeper, there were 2 more stone rooms scattered around. The ceiling was inlaid with luminous pearls. Of course, for cultivators, this was meaningless. There are 3 stone rooms in total. There are no living things, no remains. It should be a place to store the inheritance. There are many places like this in the Thousand Islands region. I've been there several times. This place is simple and crude. But what's surprising is that the things here are not simple and crude. Lu Xiaoyi carefully observed the outermost stone room. There was a niche, a cage, and a table. There were only 4 bare walls, and they were clean. He couldn't help but laugh. You've emptied it? Li Peinan was a little embarrassed. At that time, I was poor. Everything was good for me. However, most of them were materials and spirit stones. Many of them were rotten. Lu Xiaoyi activated his eyesight and saw a stone tablet in the niche. On it was engraved Cloud-Top Sword inherited by Shuang. It seemed that it was the work of a Cloud-Top Sword cultivator called by Shuang. To be able to dig out such a space in the volcanic rock, it was a little difficult for a Jindan cultivator to do so. It was most likely a Yuanian cultivator. As for the reason, only God knew. Seeing Lu Xiaoyi's puzzled look, Li Peinan hurriedly said, "There are 3 stone rooms. There's nothing in this outer room. There are 2 inner rooms. One of them contains cultivation techniques and elixirs. I've taken the cultivation techniques, but the elixirs are useless. All of them have expired and rotted. The other inner room contains the sword plate, which is the one that I used. The strange place that I told you about is here." The 2 of them walked into one of the inner rooms. It was also very simple, but there was a jade table in the middle. There was a sword rack on the jade table, but it was bare now. Lu Xiaoyi only felt that the power of the 5 elements here was somewhat special. Before he had time to think about it, Li Peinan had already took out his sword plate. There was nothing to hide. His skills were inferior, and his life was in the hands of others. He couldn't be too stingy. When he placed the sword plate on the rack, the sword plate immediately moved. It floated in the air, and the flying sword began to slowly straighten, showing the state of attack. When it was completely straightened, it started from the other side. The whole process was like a small greenish-gray snake, coiling clockwise, then straightening, then coiling anti-clockwise, then straightening again. This cycle repeated, as if it was alive. When the flying sword was completely straightened, it had the shape of a standard external flying sword. When it was completely coiled, it suddenly shrunk to the size of a mustard seed, Li Peinan explained. When I first saw this sword plate, it was in such a state. There was no formation, no spiritual vigor, and it could bend and stretch on its own. Perhaps it was because it had been moving in such a pattern that it could maintain the spiritual vigor of the sword plate for thousands of years without losing its spirituality. The question is, where did the energy for it to move like this come from? Was it the 5 elements? Or was it yin and yang? Or was it mysterious? At that time, I was only at the last stage of foundation establishment. I couldn't understand it, and I was also afraid of ruining the arrangement. Therefore, I only took the sword plate and didn't touch anything else. I thought that in the future, when my cultivation level was higher, I would come back to observe it again. Later, after I formed my Azoth core, I came again, but I still didn't discover anything. Only then did I feel that it should be the power of the Tao state. In the Jin Dan realm, the cultivator's understanding of the Tao state was very limited, especially a rogue cultivator like me. I put all my focus on my cultivation level and the sword plate, and temporarily didn't care about anything else. That's why I let it go until today. Fellow Taoist strength, insight, and knowledge are far above mine. Perhaps you can gain something from it? Chapter 646. Lu Xiaoyi pondered for a moment, and asked Li Peinan to take down his own sword plate. He then took out a flying sword embryo from his ring and placed it on the plate as well. Miraculously, the flying sword also floated up and started to bend at a speed that was hard to see with the naked eye. It could be imagined that in the future, it would also turn into a sword plate and shrink to the size of a mustard seed. Li Peinan saw that Lu Xiaoyi was very serious and finally felt relieved. He knew that his gift this time was not in vain. I also tried this at that time. In the end, I came to the conclusion that this is a place to make a sword plate. As long as a sword is placed here, it will slowly turn into a sword plate and then be stored in the dantian. However, the speed is very slow. I once waited here for several months, but the sword plate was not completed. So, I really don't know how long it will take. The best way is to place a flying sword here and then go out to do your own things. After a few decades, it will be ready. However, this kind of sword plate technique is actually not much different from practicing a flying sword in a sword case. The power of the sword plate may not be stronger than if I kept it in a sword case. Instead, it will be rusty because it will not be used for a long time. So, I didn't place a flying sword here. Fellow Taoist, you also know that the resources of us rogue cultivators are limited. We don't have any extra swords to do experiments. In the past few days, after listening to Li Peinan's introduction of the sword plate technique, Lu Xiaoyi had some understanding of this direction. It could only be said that there were several directions for flying swords, and there was no possibility of one being above the other. There was no essential difference between placing a flying sword here and keeping it in a sword case for 10 years. Because it would be away from its master for a long time, its flexibility in communication would be greatly inferior. So, Li Peinan would not do such a stupid thing. If it was discovered by others and taken away, it would be a visible loss. Lu Xiaoyi could feel the strong energy flow of the 5 elements in the center. As a rogue cultivator, it was very difficult for Li Peinan to sense these things. As a rogue cultivator, he did not have the time to work on these aspects, so he was confused. It may be related to the 5 elements. I need to deduce it in detail. Lu Xiaoyi sat down cross-legged, closed his eyes, and focused his senses. Li Peinan tactfully retreated. It was very rude to have outsiders present when others were practicing. Even if they were from the same sect, it was very rare for them to practice in the same room, not to mention that they had just met each other for the first time. When Lu Xiaoyi focused all his perception on the 5 elements in the room, everything became clear. The position of this stone room under the sea should be the eye of the 5 elements in this sea area. Not every place had the eye of the 5 elements. For example, on the whole, the Azure Sky Great World did not have a complete set of eye of the 5 elements. If there really was one that could control the 5 elements of a world, people would have long fought over it. There was no eye of the 5 elements in the northern region. In fact, there was no eye of the 5 elements in the Thousand Islands region. The 5 elements were ever-changing and intricate. You have me, you have me. Only under very special and accidental circumstances could a local eye of the 5 elements be formed in a small area, just like here. He quickly figured out the origin of the eye of the 5 elements. Because of the instability of the tectonic plates under the sea, there were often cracks, which was also the reason for the frequent occurrence of volcanoes nearby. In a long time, the tectonic plates reached a balance and began to form a dynamic balance, which was reflected in the volcanoes. There was only white smoke, but no eruption. It was also this rapid tectonic movement that created the rare eye of the 5 elements. It did not need to be far away to form the movement and balance of the power of the 5 elements in the position of the eye. This time, it took between 10,000 and 20,000 years. Without Immortal Roy talking about the 5 elements on the dome, he could not have laid the foundation. Without the eruption of spiritual vigor on Whirling Star, he could not have entered the door. Without the 10 years in the Divine Design Valley, he could not have improved to this level. The benefits were not only in the sword spirit of the 5 elements, but also now. Without so many years of rich accumulation, he would not be like Li Peinan, who entered the treasure mountain and returned empty-handed. How could he be like now, who could roughly infer the tectonic movement of 10,000 years just by the changes of the 5 elements? But there were still some subtle things. For example, how did the power of the 5 elements make the sword into a mustard seed? What was the mechanism? Was it purely natural? Or was it man-made? He needed to study it slowly, and he was not in a hurry. A month later, Li Peinan, who had been waiting anxiously, finally heard a voice. He hurriedly walked into the stone room and saw this person from Xianyuan picking up the sword rack and looking at it carefully. He even spoke casually. "You said that if I understand everything here, the lucky chance here will be mine?" Li Peinan did not hesitate. He was now like a clay bodhisattva crossing the river. He could not even protect himself. If he went to the north region, he really did not know whether he would live or die, and when he could come back. Therefore, when he made the decision to give up this place, he had already stopped treating it as his lucky chance. He could not understand it himself. In the future, this place would not exist forever. It would be discovered by someone one day. Could it be that it would be reserved for him alone? Yes, I did not accept the gift from heaven. It is my fate that is not good enough, and I can't blame others. Of all the things here, you can take whichever one you like. I will not say anything. Lu Xiaoyi did not stand on ceremony. He waved his hand and put the sword rack into his bag. He did not forget to give Li Jiazi a sweet date. Your sword plate should be the sword plate of the 5 elements, which was made by a perfected cultivator. The power you can now exert is not even 1/100th of its original power. It is purely the power of the Dharma power, using stupid strength. If you want to really exert the power of the sword plate, you have to work hard on the 5 elements. This is a long process. You have to endure loneliness and be mediocre. If you don't have this perseverance, it is better to use the sword case obediently. Your strength will grow faster. Li Peinan bowed and accepted the advice. It was impossible to say that he did not feel anything. It was just that he was a little vague and could not be sure. Rogue cultivators were like this. They had to cross the river by feeling the stones. They could not move too fast. Otherwise, if they took the wrong path, they would waste a lot of time. After leaving the stone room and putting the broken stone back in place, this exploration was considered to have come to an end. In fact, to Lu Xiaoyi, this could only be considered as half an exploration. There was no risk, and he did not have that kind of desire. The two of them did not dawdle and began to cross the ocean. This time, when they really flew, Li Peinan was very depressed. He used the orthodox art of sword control, but no matter how he flew, the Xianyuan swordsman always maintained a distance of 2,000 feet behind him. It was not more than 10 feet, not less than 10 feet. It was despairing. Fortunately, he did not have the thought of running away. Looking at the Xianyuan swordsman, he did not seem to be older than him. He did not know how the swordsman cultivated his skills. He began to doubt his belief that he was in control of his own fate and not the heavens. Not to mention the heavens, even the Xianyuan swordsman would not be able to cross this hurdle. Didn't they say that the elites of Mount E had all gone to the 5th ring? If such a person was eliminated, how could others live in this world? Don't practice the sword anymore. Go and concoct pills. Chapter 647. Several months later, at the Qianqiu peak of Mount E, a sword rack was placed on a large table in the hall, and the most precious materials of the 5 elements were placed around it. A flying sword was bending at a speed that was almost invisible to the naked eye on the sword rack. Lu Xiaoyi, who was at the side, had his face flushed red due to excessive use of the power of the Tao realm of the 5 elements. I can't do it. My power of the 5 elements is still too weak. I only have the shape, but not the essence. If I want to use it well, I need you. Spiritual Master Nan laughed. I can't do it either. This old man is barely good at yin and yang, but in terms of the 5 elements, I only have a little bit more cultivation than you. In fact, my understanding is not much better, so I won't make a fool of myself. Little E, I have never seen someone who has the same understanding of the 5 elements as you at the Jing Dan stage. Not bad, not bad. You didn't go to Thousand Ji Valley to make trouble. If you could have gotten the 5 elements mountain, it would have been perfect. Lu Xiaoyi took a sip of the wine cup on the table. Spiritual Master Nan was also known as Spiritual Master Jiu. His wine was not ordinary. but now it was only used to quench his thirst, which made the owner feel a little heartache. "Martial uncle, you really dare to say that? If I really got it, would you dare to take it? I'm afraid the 3 Pure Ones army will follow soon. Later you will blame me for being careless." Spiritual Master Nan smiled. "I have also heard Senior Perfected Cultivator talk about this sword plate. It is also a direction of sword vein inheritance, but it is still far from perfection. In terms of its nature, it is more or less the same. After hundreds and thousands of years of practice, it is a competition of cultivation, spirit, Tao realm, and understanding of the great Tao. As for where the sword comes from, whether it comes from the sword case or from the dantian, even if it comes from the valley, it is just a different channel. The essence is unchanged." Lu Xiaoyi asked for advice. "Martial uncle, when I was in the stomach of the sea beast, the sword case didn't come out. It makes people very depressed. They have the strength but can't use it, so they always want to find a way to use the sword that ignores the realm. It is better than being captured. If it was a swordsman, would he be suppressed and not be able to use the sword pill?" The Southern Spiritual Master poked him. "You shouldn't think like that. Why did he have to use his sword in front of a cultivator who was 1 level higher than him? This was not a good habit. Our Xuanyuan's philosophy is that I have the ability to use my sword, but this is only the last resort. Do you feel that you are too weak and have the heart of the sword of someone who has lost his sword?" Lu Xiaoyi nodded. If he was still in the state of a rice worm when he was in Foundation establishment, it wouldn't be a big deal if he couldn't unsheath his sword. But now that he was striding towards the path of a pure swordsman, he couldn't take it anymore. Reverend Nan sighs. "You should know that the ancient inheritance of Xian Yuan. We are deviants who broke away from the Taoist sect, so it is reasonable for us to be called the Devil Sect. At that time, we didn't care about Sword Heart, nor did we care about Devil Heart. Everything was for the sake of survival, and then kill you. For this, he would do anything. There was no such thing as strength of character. When we should kneel, we shouldn't stand. That was our true way of doing things. Later it didn't work. Everyone had to talk about Tao Heart. If we didn't talk about Tao Heart, we would be condemned by everyone, and we wouldn't be able to survive. So we started to change. If we could change a Tao tradition, why couldn't you? Then there was the saying of Sword Heart. It was nothing more than flaunting that we wouldn't use unscrupulous means to do things. But you should know that if you want to survive, how could you not use unscrupulous means? So you must distinguish between what you say and what you do." These were words that only those who truly treated him as one of their own would say. Perhaps they wouldn't recognize him after leaving the house, but these were the old Taoist experiences for nearly 1,000 years. Something like Sword Heart might appear one day when you become a sword immortal, but before that, you definitely can't have it. You have to constantly remind yourself that I haven't become an immortal yet, and that I will still die. So occasionally not having Sword Heart is normal. That is the true Sword Heart. Do you understand? Lu Xiaoyi laughed. Just say it directly. Treat Sword Heart as a lofty goal that can never be accomplished. That's just for people to hear. You can achieve your goal however you want in private. Is that what you mean? The Nan Taoist smile remained. So don't develop the habit of being wrong. I am a swordsman. I would rather die standing than live kneeling. How old are you to still believe this? If you can live like a coward, then live first. At worst, you can just find an opportunity to make up for it. So what I mean to say to you is that when you encounter an unsolvable danger that far surpasses your opponent, you should first choose whether or not you can live like a coward, and then consider whether or not you can use your sword. If this order is reversed and you develop a habit, how many lives do you have left to fill it with? Seeing Lu Xiaoyi deep in thought, the old Taoist continued. A person's life is a life of helplessness. The most hateful thing is that kind of saying that encourages people to live without shame to the heavens, without shame to the earth. You deserve to be called the heavens. You shouldn't have been born. You deserve to be called the earth. You should have starved to death. People need to know reverence. More importantly, they need to learn to cover up their own brilliance. This is the prerequisite to be able to go on forever. Seeing this little guy lowering his head and pondering, the old Taoist spat in satisfaction. He was talking in a roundabout way. It could be said the same way, or it could be said the other way round. As a senior guide, he was very clear about the meaning of education. It was not for the pursuit of truth, but for balance. If it was someone like the ice guest, who had the mental state of most swordsmen from Mount Shao, he would have to say the opposite of what he said today. You have to talk about sword heart with people. Talk about the glory of Xian Yuan. Talk about the spirit of no turning back. Talk about the momentum of who else but me. Because they lack this. Make up for what they lack. This is the foundation of education. But for this little guy in front of him, his problem was that his spirit was strong enough. It was so strong that it was not limited to his own realm, but wanted to pass the sword to a higher realm. In such a situation, he had to pour cold water on him to wake him up. He did not want him to go crazy and lose his life in the end. Just like riding a horse, when to use the whip and spur, and when to rein in the horse to chew the horse's head, it all depended on the situation. This was what a good guide should do. If you had to lash the whip on a wild horse that was running wildly, there was no other possibility other than exhausting it to death. If you had to reason with a lazy horse and tighten the rein, there was no other possibility other than it running slower and less capable. Going with the flow and teaching according to the student's aptitude was the best way to achieve a valuable balance. Only then could the horse run faster and longer. This little guy was very much to his liking. He did not need to worry about the direction of his martial arts. Now, his 5 elements transformation was almost as good as a senior Yuanying. He was bold and careful when doing things. He knew how to weigh the pros and cons. He knew that he should not use force to decide everything. He was not a reckless man. This was what he valued the most. Swordsmen should not play mind games with the Dharma lineage. But at the very least, you must have your own balance. The Dharma lineage was hoping that you would become a bloodthirsty man. At that time, the Dharma lineage would not even need to make a move. The heavenly Tao would take care of you. What he wanted to stop was this little guy's confidence that had gradually swelled because everything had been going smoothly for him. Confidence was a good thing. When it swelled, it was like a bubble that would burst with a poke. The little guy himself could not feel it. This was a complicated and slow process. This was the time for an experienced old cultivator like him to show the meaning of his existence. He was very willing, because this was Xuanyuan's future. Chapter 648. Time is like cutting, the past is like castrating, life is a drama, cultivation is a drama. The old Jinren threw another bean into his mouth and chewed it with relish. He enjoyed the atmosphere of educating the younger generation. Of course, the premise was that the younger generation was worthy of teaching. If it were some ordinary blockheads, he wouldn't be interested either. It's like a drama on the stage. Some act as hoodlums, and some act as scholars. In the end, there's only one goal, which is to marry the eldest daughter of the minister's family. In the cultivation world, the eldest daughter is immortal. Xian Yuan is only pretending to be a hoodlum, he's not a real hoodlum. The difference can't be confused. Just like the 3 pure ones are only pretending to be scholars, he's not a real scholar. Think carefully about the things they did, the methods they used. Are they something that a pure scholar can do? If the Dharma lineage is like this, how should I, Xian Yuan, act as a hoodlum as a swordsman? You have to have a scale in your heart. On the stage of cultivation, the Dharma lineage wants us to become real hoodlums. And we expect them to become real scholars. Looking at the direction of history, everyone has a good grasp of the situation. Hoodlums are fake hoodlums, scholars are fake scholars. This is the essence of the cultivation world. If you don't understand this, you'll be trapped in your so-called sword heart and Tao heart, What is a heart? Every man for himself, and the devil takes the hindmost. Lu Xiaoyi felt that the longer he knew the Nanjinren, the more unfathomable he felt. But it made him feel closer to him. Because some of his complaints about the cultivation world, the blue sky 5 rings, and even the heavenly Tao were not written down in words. They were the essence of his life and cultivation. I understand. You have to act like whatever you want. You have to learn to distinguish between what's on the stage and what's off the stage. The Nanjinren stroked his beard and smiled. When I was young, there was a bully in town. His notoriety spread far and wide. He often walked through the streets with his arms crossed. There was no shop that didn't pay him respect. When the new government took over and cleaned up the town, countless hoodlums were caught, but he was the only one who was unharmed. It was very strange. Later on, when they grew up, they met by chance. She asked him how he was able to stay out of trouble when the whole town was being purged. Did he have some kind of backer in the new yamen? In the end, this person laughed and said, I'm just a bumpkin who was born and raised here. My family has not had a single official for dozens of generations. How could I have any backing in the yamen? The reason why he was safe and sound was actually very simple. The new yamen was investigating all the murders in the town, but none of them were related to him. This was what it meant to be a good actor. I'm a Xianyuan swordsman, and it's impossible for me not to kill people. If you can achieve a reputation for being ruthless without causing too much karma, then that's a good acting. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. People like Uncle Master are the real veteran actors and role models for our generation. Spiritual Master Nan shook his head and sighed. You're wrong. In my era, at my level, I didn't even have the chance to step onto the stage. After all, only a small number of people were able to step onto the stage. Most of them were just spectators. But you're different. You've always been on the stage. You're in the Zhuji phase, Jin Dan, and you'll definitely be there when you become a nascent soul. So, you have to act well. Act so that everyone knows you're a hoodlum. Lu Xie sighed. If only I could step off the stage. He also knew that this was impossible. Standing on the stage was pressure, but it was also a driving force. It all depended on how you borrowed the force. His path was not the kind of path that people wouldn't know if he was raised in the deep mountains, but would become famous overnight. But then again, how long would it take to be raised in the deep mountains? What was known throughout the world? Was it Jin Dan? Yuanying? Immortal? Or an immortal? If he really became an immortal, then what was the meaning of his past? Let's talk about the Li family's son you brought back. What, do you want to take him into Xianyuan? Spiritual Master Nan changed the topic. Lu Xiaoyi began to shirk responsibility. It's not easy to kill him in the Thousand Islands region. Rogue cultivators can see it. It doesn't match Xuanyuan's image of accepting talented swordsmen. Moreover, his crimes are nothing to Xianyuan, and he also contributed the secret of the sword plate. I can't deal with him, and I don't know when he'll return to his old ways if he stays in the Thousand Islands region. So, I can only bring him back and let the sect deal with him. It's up to Martial Uncle whether to slowly win his heart or restrain him for a period of time so that he can completely change his character. I have no objection. Spiritual Master Nan snorted. This brat was very cunning to push this matter to him. With the current strength of Jin Dan in Mount E, they really needed this kind of new blood. Talented in swordplay and able to fight on the spot, Mount E needed this kind of talent very much. But regarding the cultivation of cultivators, Jin Dan and Zhuji were very different. Zhuji was easy to cultivate. Even if he was born in another province, he could be taught how to become a real swordsman over a long period of time and have a sense of attachment to the sect. Jin Dan was different. The process of core formation was a process of initial determination of spirit and will. After core formation, it was very difficult to change. If another wolf was introduced to Mount E, it would be very troublesome. What do you think? You've been in contact with him, so you know his past. Lu Xiaoyi thought for a while and decided to tell the truth. This person's character is a bit extreme. If he's used in the wrong place, it's easy to cause trouble. In the hidden territory on the deserted island, he was very generous. Of course, he had no choice but to do so. He was under the control of others and was just looking for a way to survive. He was not really willing to submit to Xianyuan. It was a process. If it was the foundation establishment stage, it would be even more so for the golden core stage. What makes me curious is that he's very dafa about the inheritance of the secret realm. Not only the sword frame, but also those skills about the sword plate that he took before. But he's missing one thing. Nanjunren nodded. He's missing the last words of the inheritor. Lu Xiaoyi continued. Although disciples rarely explore the secret realm, after observing the process of exploration, and considering the mentality of the inheritor, it's impossible that he didn't give any instructions to the successor. For example, to take care of the family? Who are the enemies? Which orthodoxy is the enemy? If you can't satisfy the inheritor's request, why would he give you all the secrets? You have to complete some last words for the inheritor. Only then can you live up to this opportunity. The orthodoxy of the sword vein in the Thousand Islands region basically came from the Cloud-Top Sword Palace. Many individual cultivators learned swordsmanship from this inheritance, and were still willing to submit to Xianyuan. It was only because this inheritance had been passed down for countless generations that the past hatred had long faded. Who would be willing to bear the illusory karma of a conflict from 10 to 20,000 years ago? But the sword plate inheritance in the desert island's secret realm hadn't been passed down for many generations. Since the inheritor set up this place 10,000 years ago, Li Jiazi was the first and only inheritor. Then, what last words did the inheritor leave for him? What did he want to achieve? What plans did he have? This was almost inevitable, but he didn't mention anything about this. Was this really the noble character and unquestionable integrity of the Cloud-Top Swordsman? Only for the sword and nothing else? Is this the style of the Cloud-Top? Chapter 649. Seeing Nanjunren's silence, Lu Xiaoyi joked. If it were you, one day you had no choice but to leave your legacy somewhere outside. Other than techniques and artifacts, what other instructions would you leave behind? The universe is peaceful, cultivators treat each other with respect, and mortals live and work in peace and contentment. Nanjunren said righteously. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. Martial uncle, this isn't a stage, can't you stop acting? Nanjunren chuckled. This is indeed a problem. Is there anything else? Lu Xiaoyi was very cautious this time. There's also the sword board. This is a brand new direction. Although it doesn't seem to be superior to our external sword case, we have to admit that the sword board's transformation into a mustard seed into a dantian has its own uniqueness. If we can really turn the sword board technique into a system, establish a path to advance, and promote it at the foundation building level, with the sword board's external appearance being closer to the internal sword's characteristics, I'm afraid that most sword cultivators will choose the sword board, right? So, was this a trap that had been laid out for a long time? This disciple's knowledge is limited, and I can't make a decision, so I need the sect to make the decision. This is the real reason why I pulled this person to Xianyuan. Instead of staying outside, it's better to stay on Mount Shao and observe from a close distance. Nanjunren nodded with gratification. To be able to see the big picture from the small details, Xiaoyi, you have a talent for acting. Ever since Xianyuan established the external sword lineage, every generation of external sword ancestors has never stopped looking for a way to make external swords stronger. For this reason, we've tried countless methods, made many choices, removed the impurities, and obtained the relatively mature external sword system. So far, this is the most suitable for us. But it's still not the end. As for the sword board, it's another orthodoxy that exists in the distant universe in another sword vein. We've occasionally heard of it, but we don't know the truth. The thing you brought this time is very detailed, and has the foundation for a deep understanding. I'll say the same thing. Techniques and artifacts are dead, but people are alive. The direction of swordsmanship is only to serve people, and there's nothing good or bad about it. If this is a trap, but we are human beings, we can extract the essence and discard the dregs. What is there that can't be used? I will report this matter to the Supremes and even pass it on to the Fifth Ring so that the external Sword Supremes can study it together, determine its mechanism, identify its effects, and establish a system. If everything goes well, we may try it out on a very small scale. This process would take a very long time, at least 1,000 years. In the end, if it was to be popularized, it would require cultivators who had reached the level of true monarch to be able to see the advantages and disadvantages of this system. Only then will you be able to decide whether Xuanyuan's external sword should be the sword box and the sword plate, or both. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. So troublesome? How cautious? Nanjunan smiled. Qianyuan people have enough experience to deal with this kind of thing, whether it's immortal fruit or poison. You should know that many of the things we have in Qianyuan are snatched from outside. Even the 5 great fundamental laws, which one of them was completely created by ourselves? Whether one's cultivation skills were high or not depended on how well one copied them. We have experience. Lu Xiaoyi sighed in admiration. It seems that this disciple was thinking too much. I thought that we would need to control the sword plate technique to spread in Mount Shao. I was afraid that if it really spread, one day a fatal flaw would appear. Then, as the person who brought the sword plate in, I would have committed a great crime. Nanjunan smiled proudly. Copying is also a real skill. To copy something new, to copy something new, to copy something new, to copy it to the point that even the originators begin to doubt whether their orthodoxy came from Qianyuan in ancient times. That's right. Therefore, we never refuse people who use sword techniques to set us up. If one comes, we will eat one. If a pair comes, we will eat a pair. Qianyuan has a good appetite. What can you do about it? Lu Xiaoyi despised this old man's shameless appearance and ridiculed him. You keep bragging. In fact, we only have this kind of confidence when it comes to sword techniques. Because we are the most professional on the path of the sword. Can it be like this on cultivation skills? After tens of thousands of years, aren't there still 5 fundamental skills? Nanjunan chuckled. Cultivation skills and sword techniques are 2 different things. Don't say it, don't say it. But I have to warn you. Because of your personal experience, you're one step ahead of the others. With your temper, once you've taken this step, you definitely won't back down halfway. I won't stop you or advise you. I only have one thing to say. Among the flying swords you are so proud of, you can only use one flying sword to test the sword plate. Before you are sure that the sword plate technique is correct, don't add all the chips. In addition, if you find that the sword plate has an effect on your dantian during the process of practicing the sword plate, or that there is a state of rejection between the sword plate and the sword case, you must stop your attempt. Report it to the sect and let everyone think of a solution. Of course, I will also report the results of the sect's research on the sword plate to you. Well, you are one of the founders. You have the right to know this. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. He knew that Nanjunan was doing this for his own good. The difference between the sword case and the sword plate was huge. It was not only the position of the sword. To put it simply, the sword plate was not engraved with a sword formation. Instead, it was strengthened by immersing in a special Tao state for a long time. For example, Li Peinan's sword plate was a flying sword that contained the truth of the 5 elements. This was the advantage of the sword plate. Of course, when a swordsman outside Qianyuan reached the Yuanying state, his flying sword could also be cultivated in a special Tao state environment. In this aspect, there was no difference. In the end, the competition was not about the sword case or the sword plate, but about the understanding of the Tao state. Different roads lead to the same goal. Nanjunan became serious. I know what you mean. The biggest difference between the sword plate and the sword case is that one can be inherited, and the other can't. The sword plate can be inherited. This means that a swordsman can obtain a powerful sword plate from his seniors or through other methods. His strength will immediately increase greatly, just like that son of the Li family. If this kind of inheritance system prevails in the end, the fighting strength of the low-level swordsmen in Xianyuan will increase by leaps and bounds. This is because they can borrow the glory of their ancestors. But whose glory will their ancestors borrow? There are only a few half-immortals. How can they divide it? Therefore, the sword plate technique does not increase the strength of a sword vein. An inheritance that can't increase the power of a supreme swordsman's swordsmanship doesn't surpass the sword case technique in essence. Lu Xiaoyi pondered for a moment and asked, Martial uncle, since the sword plate can be passed down, does it mean that the sword plate will never produce a sword spirit? Chapter 650. Nanjinren clapped his hands and laughed. Good question, that's the essence. And it's what we're going to prove in the end. If the sword disc method can reach the same probability as the sword box method after hundreds of years of practice, it will be the same as the sword box method. It can be widely promoted, and the two methods can be used side by side, and the practitioners can choose for themselves. If the sword disc method can't produce a sword spirit in the end and can only be passed down to disciples and juniors, I reckon that with the Supreme's foresight, they won't allow the sword disc method to become popular. At the very least, they will put an end to it in the middle and lower levels, because this is a method that encourages the middle and lower level cultivators to be lazy. Whether there is a sword spirit or not, it has a great influence on the flying sword. You know this the best. What if I turn a flying sword with a sword spirit into a sword disc? Lu Xiaoyi asked quietly. Nanjinren stared at him. That's why I'm only allowing you to use one flying sword. It's not easy to get a sword spirit, so it's not suitable to take risks. Nanjinren didn't mention the problem of how to control the sword smoothly in front of someone whose state was higher than his. On the one hand, he didn't support such a rash behavior, on the other hand, it involved too complicated a problem that needed to be considered comprehensively, and couldn't be compared alone. Just like Lu Xiaoyi, he couldn't do anything in the stomach of the sea beast, but he could handle it with ease in front of Master Jingqin. Was it because the strength of the sea beast was higher than Jingqin? Obviously, it wasn't because of that. It was because of the environment at that time. In the special space of the sea beast, he was under the greatest pressure of the state. The other three pure ones were the same. So, there was no conclusion. We won't conclude that the son of the Li family is guilty. Let's talk about the facts. He did make a contribution in the sword disc. I'll arrange someone to take him to familiarize himself with Mount Shao, and then we'll leave everything to time, hoping that he can devote himself to the array of Mount Shao. Based on my personal experience, in most cases, his promise to the ruins will fade with time. After all, it's not something that he can empathize with, and he doesn't have any personal grudges against it. How can a short will be more beneficial to him than a sect? Li Mu thought. Or was it years or decades of help? Here, he'll have a new beginning, new friends, new teachers, and even a new Taoist companion. It'll form a circle that no one can escape from, tightly surrounding him. First, he'll endure it, then he'll be lost, and he'll be in a trance because of a dilemma. Then he'll make a choice after weighing the pros and cons, and completely submit to Mount Shao, and get a new life. We think that's the process of getting the Taoist heart. Lu Xiaoyi looked at this shrewd and cunning old man who could see through people's hearts. He was very lucky that this was his teacher. What if he doesn't have such a Taoist heart? The old Taoist expression did not change. That means he doesn't have the potential to cultivate. You brought it by Nanjinren by face? Lu Xiaoyi sighed. I to do by I'll do the dirty work. After all, I'm a rogue. When he returned to the cave residence, he was surprised to find that it had become clean and tidy again. Even the floor was clean and shiny. Fresh ingredients were neatly placed, and there were freshly picked snow lotuses in the vase. These things were left by the original owner, and he didn't take them away. But now they looked really pleasing to the eye. Did Bing Ke come back to visit his family? The rules of the sect were very strict. Without Xuanyuan's order and the permission of his grassland master, he couldn't come back without permission. This trip to the Thousand Island region was very rewarding. The significance of the sword plate to him was different from that of others, because he didn't lack a sword spirit. He valued the quality of being able to use his sword in front of powerful existences. There was no contradiction between me being able to use my sword and being a coward. I must have the ability to resist. Even if I can't turn the tables, I still have to beat you. Although Nanjunren didn't say it, with his decades of experience, Jing Dan could roughly figure out why he couldn't use his sword. It was nothing more than the difference between the inner secret field and the outer secret field. The inner secret field was the core of a cultivator's self-control area. Simply speaking, it was the cultivator's own body. This was also the most powerful aura field of a cultivator. For example, when he was in the stomach of the sea beast, he was in the inner secret field. His sword case belonged to the outer secret field. It was not in his body, but on his back, relying on the connection of his mana and spirit. Once he was in the upper secret field like the stomach of the sea beast, he naturally couldn't use his sword. But the sword pill of the inner sword belonged to the inner secret field. As long as the swordsman's unyielding willpower was still there, he could definitely use his sword. For the time being, he couldn't put the flying sword into his sea of consciousness, like the inner sword. But the existence of the sword plate allowed him to put the flying sword into his dantian. Since it was also in the inner secret field, he could use his sword regardless of the realm pressure. He must have at least one flying sword in the state of full attack to make him feel at ease. The experience in the stomach of the sea beast was really terrible. He was in a completely involuntary state. As for the sword plate, he always had a natural instinct towards swords, so he didn't feel that there was any risk. The reason why he reminded the Nanjunan was that the sword plate system might cause the middle and low-level swordsmen to be lazy and rely on it. His attention would be diverted from his own cultivation to the sword plate system that was given to him by his seniors. The situation he was talking about was a long-term, psychological situation, and not the sword plate system itself. Waiting for the sword masters to come up with a plan was a long process. It could easily take hundreds of years. It was also a responsible attitude towards the future of the sect. But for him, it was too much of a drag. He couldn't afford to wait. After careful consideration, he decided to use the 4 seasons for this experiment. This was also the sword spirit that had been with him the longest. It was also one of the sword spirits of the 5 elements. How to use the sword plate. He wouldn't find a pile of precious materials of the 5 elements to complete the process like he did in the Rising Heaven Pavilion. At that time, he only did that to let the Nanjunren see more clearly. It wasn't the correct way to revolve the sword. In order to avoid the uncontrollable process, he decided to use his own power of the 5 elements to revolve the sword. This process was bound to be very slow, but the advantage was that he could control the process at any time. If there was an accident, he could immediately stop it. At the same time, he could also train his own power of the 5 elements. He still had plenty of time. It was enough for him to complete some of his own ideas. The process wasn't too complicated for a cultivator with a certain level of power of the 5 elements. First, he would use the power of the 5 elements to revolve the sword clockwise. When the bending force of the sword reached the balance of the 5 elements, he would stop. Then, he would slowly loosen the sword. Then, he would use the power of the 5 elements to revolve the sword counterclockwise. When the sword stopped moving, he would slowly recover. In this way, as time went by and the power of the 5 elements increased, the angle of the flying sword would become bigger and bigger. Until one day, the flying sword would be completely revolved into a tight ball. It would form a miniature eye of the 5 elements. The flying sword would be the eye of the formation. It could shrink into a mustard seed and be placed anywhere by the cultivator. Chapter 651. A few days later, in the morning, a figure came to Lu Xiaoyi's cave residence again, and changed all his daily necessities for him. They hadn't seen each other for a while, and Linka seemed to have changed a lot. He was in a good state of mind, and also had some high-spirited spirit, which was very different from the previous idleness. However, he was still a little far from entering the bearing essence stage. Lu Xiaoyi stopped him. "Why are you staying in Shao Mountain like this? Don't you want to go to the grassland? Or do you want to enjoy life, and don't want to suffer? Did the sect call you back?" Linka answered honestly. "No, the sect didn't call me back." "Then did your grassland master give you a vacation?" "No. The master and apprentice system of the grassland people is like that of a father and a son. Life and death are at stake. Apprentices always have tasks that they can't finish. They sleep later than dogs, and wake up earlier than chickens. People like us from Xianyuan are better, but those grassland shamans live like donkeys." "Then why did you come back?" Lu Xiaoyi felt very strange. Linka was hesitant. "My grassland master tried to break through the level of senior shaman a few days ago. Maybe he didn't prepare well enough, and he was a little impatient, so he blew himself up." Lu Xiaoyi was shocked. "Your supernatural power worked again?" Linka said with a crying voice. "Martial uncle, please understand. This really has nothing to do with me. He wanted to break through the level himself, and I couldn't stop him. The grassland shaman is also very barbaric, and he bled a lot. There was no way to save him, and even a complete limb couldn't be found. Martial uncle, it really has nothing to do with me, I'm innocent." Lu Xiaoyi waved his hand to stop him, and walked around in circles in the room. Let me think, let me see if Xianyuan has any great enemies outside, and then I'll ask you to go and be apprenticed. It seems to be the 3 pure ones. Think of a way, and we can communicate with the 3 pure ones." Binka felt like she was sitting on pins and needles. "Uncle, you can't push me into the fire pit." Lu Xiaoyi laughed and stopped joking. However, he also couldn't let this guy go so easily. Even though his master was gone, his own life force was still very vigorous. Was this the same as swallowing his master's destiny every time he acknowledged him as his master? It was even more powerful than his interception team. Can't you tell? It's like this. Everyone else is busy, so you can't be idle, right? The Cloud Peak of the Thousand Islands region is a chaotic place. I want you to disguise as a rogue cultivator and go there to unite all the forces that can be united. Let's start with the swordsman. But you can't expose your identity as Xuanyuan's disciple. Otherwise, no matter how many masters you have, I'm afraid they won't be able to save you. The current ice guest was very different from the previous ice guest. The ups and downs over the years had given him considerable training, especially in the state of mind. He was no longer timid and afraid of responsibility. Besides, Uncle allowed him not to appear as Xuanyuan's swordsman, which meant that he could pretend to be a coward at appropriate times. In this case, with his strength, he could still survive among the rogue cultivators. So he was very straightforward. Yes, Uncle, you can give me the mission. I dare not say that I will definitely complete it, but I will definitely try my best to not disgrace the sect. Lu Xiaoyi was very satisfied. Sit. There's no rush. There's no teleportation formation in the Thousand Islands region, and you can't fly there by yourself. You have to wait for one of your uncle masters to go there and bring you along. During this period of time, don't be idle. You can learn more about the actual situation on the Cloud Peak. I will also give you the details of the mission later. Do you know who to look for? There's a new swordsman in our Shao Mountain. He's quite capable. He's Jin Dan, a rogue cultivator from the Cloud Lake Archipelago. You can try to get close to him. He's not familiar with this place, and he's very lonely with no one to talk to. He needs someone to relieve his loneliness. You can kill two birds with one stone. The ice guest understood something. He was also a very clever person. So his eyes lit up, and he said mysteriously, "Uncle, do you mean that I should find a chance to be his disciple?" Lu Xiaoyi hurriedly stopped him. He couldn't do that. As the only observation target with fate in Shao Mountain, he didn't want to lose his target so quickly. No. At his level, it's a waste to use your supernatural power. We'll find another chance and find another person. We have to satisfy your desire to be his disciple. It's a pity if we don't use such a good supernatural power. These trivial matters were related to Lu Xiaoyi's education plan. The ice guest was an important part of his plan. As long as he could succeed, Lu Xiaoyi would launch a huge publicity storm in Shao Mountain, and put this little satellite on the news. Just like the sniper in the movie. Enemies at the gate. In his previous life, he would also bring about a chasing environment for cultivation in Shao Mountain. This was the most effective and most convenient method he could think of. It was impossible for him to teach them one by one. It would never happen. The days finally calmed down. Lu Xiaoyi continued his own pace. From the core formation stage, he focused more on cultivation. Later, he focused more on swordsmanship. Now, he gradually reached a balance. In terms of swordsmanship, the two sword formations were the most likely places for him to tap into his potential, the Big Dipper sword formation and the Five Elements sword formation. Since he couldn't achieve a breakthrough in the frequency of sword attacks like the inner sword, he could only make up for it through sword formations. His learning of sword formations was different from other people's learning of sword formations. Under normal circumstances, swordsmen would first learn about sword formations, and then familiarize themselves with the Tao state through sword formations. Most of the time, they would only know the surface of sword formations. They wouldn't understand it well, and they couldn't understand it well, because their realm wasn't there yet. Lu Xiaoyi's difference was that his Big Dipper sword formation was learned under the premise of forming the celestial core, while the Five Elements sword formation was expanded after he had a deep understanding of the Five Elements. It meant that he first understood the foundation of the Tao state, and then learned the expansion of the human cultivators. Not only did he improve rapidly, but he could also master things at a very deep level. This was why when he used the Big Dipper sword formation, Xingqin felt as if the stars in the sky were pressing down on him. This was no longer a normal Jin Dan sword formation, but it was an effect that could only be achieved with the help of the seven sword spirits after Lu Xiaoyi had mastered a certain degree of the core mechanism. Now, he wasn't just working on the speed and weight of the sword. He had finally jumped out of the limitations of the foundation establishment stage, and started to have his own new world. Senior Sister Smoky had once told him that in Jin Dan's realm, his strengths and characteristics might not be able to give him the ability to crush others. This was right. However, he quickly discovered new ways to crush others, such as the Big Dipper sword formation and the Five Elements sword formation. This was a newly developed virgin land with countless possibilities and limitless potential. And this wasn't the end of his hard work. Chapter 652. Lu Xiaoyi had an even greater ambition. That was the sword plate. After the sword plate was completed, he began to dabble in sword light division. He had always been envious of the method of drawing the inner sword. He had always believed that the method of the inner sword was the best way to draw a sword. Because the sword was raised in the sea of consciousness in the Naiwen Palace, it could influence the cultivator's understanding of the great Tao to the greatest extent. What kind of flying sword was the most powerful? It was not the flying sword in the sword case, it was the external control field. Whether it was the magic power or the soul, it was not completely integrated with the cultivator, it was seamless. It was also not the sword plate in the Dantian. Although this was already an inner secret field, it was an inner secret force field, not an inner secret spiritual field. There was a difference between the two. The higher the realm of the swordsman, the more the determining factors of the flying sword's power would be. Materials, sword formation, carving, sword embryo, these things could be modified by the Supremes with their own consciousness. It was not a problem at all. Magic power, cultivation, these things were becoming more and more basic, cornerstones, but they could not be used to build a skyscraper. The higher the level of the flying sword, the more the determining factor would become singular. It was the spiritual force, the Tao state, the sword spirit, and other mysterious categories that could not be seen or touched. Therefore, if he wanted to crush those of the same realm forever, he had to start in this aspect in advance. He did not want to put the sword plate in the dantian when he refined the sword plate. Spiritual Master Nan underestimated his madness. His goal was to put the sword plate in the sea of consciousness in the same position as the inner sword. Only in this way would his sword spirit flying sword be able to unleash its full potential. Only in this way could his flying sword be able to achieve the sword light division that determined the level of the swordsman's battle power. It was not like the outer sword, which was neither high nor low, producing hundreds or thousands of sword lights. It was not comparable to the inner sword, which could easily produce tens of thousands of sword lights. Not only did he want to crush the outer sword, he also wanted to crush the inner sword. Of course, he wanted to crush the Dharma lineage. To do this, he could not take the normal path. Furthermore, he did not think that there would be any problems putting the flying sword in the sea of consciousness. What he found strange was that the outer sword lineage had existed for tens of thousands of years. Why did no one think of this method? The prerequisite was that the flying sword had to be formed into a sword plate. How slow was the process of wielding the sword? Lu Shi's answer was that he had coiled the four-seasons sword for 3 whole years. Finally, he had coiled it from a straight sword to a curved saber. So slow that it made one's hair stand on end. However, the process of controlling the sword had always been improving and optimizing, not only because of his own efforts, but also because of the help of the Tao masters of the outer swords of Mount Shao. These Tao masters of the outer swords who stayed behind carefully judged and tested the sword disc, and began to give their personal opinions. This was the strength of a sect, the collective wisdom. In a few years, the Tao masters of the outer swords from the 5th ring would also join in. This was what Reverend Nan had been talking about, plagiarism. However, Lu Xiaoyi had always insisted on not borrowing the external power of the 5 elements. He was not in a hurry because his goal was to place it in his sea of consciousness. That was a place that was much more delicate and fragile than his dantian. He had to be careful enough. Only by using his own pure power of the 5 elements could he achieve perfect control of the sword disc. Otherwise, if he was in a hurry and one day succeeded in wielding the sword disc and placing it in his sea of consciousness, once the surrounding environment of the 5 elements went out of control and he used the external power of the 5 elements, it was possible that the sword disc would straighten in his sea of consciousness. It was equivalent to shooting out a foot-long flying sword from his head. It was basically an act of suicide. Later generations would write. Cigarette, but on a certain day, because of trivial matters, he became tired of the world. He flicked his flying sword and stabbed his head. End of story. It was precisely because he was completely using his own power of the 5 elements, and did not borrow the various materials or environment of the 5 elements, that his speed of wielding the sword was as slow as a snail. This was because of the limitations of his own realm. To Jin Dan cultivators, the power of Tao that they could control was, after all, different from Yuanying. During this period, he would occasionally go on a few small missions. Every year during the spring sacrifice, he would go to the grassland to observe the ceremony of the witches, hoping to find something from it. He believed that he would definitely be able to find something, as long as he persevered. 3 years later, after greeting Zhenan Nan, he entered Zhonglao Peak and returned to the anti-material world again. He had already formed his gold core for nearly 100 years. It was time to raise his cultivation to the middle stage of Jin Dan. This was the cornerstone. It was the only thing that was indispensable in the complicated and confusing cultivation. Only with cultivation could one be called a cultivator. Without cultivation, no matter how high one's vision was or how deep one's understanding was, one was still a mortal. This time, Lu Xiaoyi did not go to the mountain peak he was familiar with. Instead, he went in a different direction. According to his judgment, he would come to this place many times over the next few hundred years. So, why did he have to fix himself in this place? Every time he changed his direction, he changed his cultivation place, and he changed to a new city and human environment. He tasted different delicacies, experienced different cultural customs, and helped different women who needed help. It was also a kind of happiness. At the foot of Shao Mountain, there were many things that could not be released too casually. Old Man Nan had too many spies. He would know even if he farted. It was not as free as here. Qing Kong was a good place. Here, he truly understood the 5 elements, and obtained the sword plate technique. He could also easily shuttle back and forth between the material and anti-material worlds. There was no place more suitable for him to cultivate than here. He was grateful for the punishment given to him by the big shots of the 5th ring, although their punishments were not very severe. If it was in the past, Lu Xiaoyi would be complacent about this. He would think that his luck was good and that it was natural. But now, he did not think so. This was not luck, but the cultivation of their disciples by the sect. Although the big cultivators did not understand the reason, they could send their disciples to the most suitable place for them. He had slowly developed a sense of belonging to Xianyuan. Although this feeling came a little slowly, it was there. This was also the reason why he was very concerned about the mysterious luck in the recent 100 years. It was not entirely for himself, but he was worried whether this mysterious change was targeted at the 5th ring. Qing Kong? His sect? Otherwise, he could not explain why these strange things kept revolving around him. He was just a small figure. Did it need to be so troublesome? So, or rather, it revolved around Xianyuan? Whether it was Whirling Planet when he was in the 5th ring or the grassland near Shao Mountain. The troublesome thing was that luck was something that could not be explained to his sect. He could also feel the cautiousness of the existence of luck. If he spread his secret, he would lose this luck. The collapse of the great Tao of destiny could only exist in this small circle of people with luck. It was like another world of cultivation. A stage for people with luck. But why could there be people in the grassland who could wholesale luck? He needed to find out the reason. So as long as he was in Qing Kong, he would never miss the sacrifice of the grassland people. He was not afraid of thieves stealing, but he was afraid of thieves remembering. Sooner or later, he would have to remember something from it. Chapter 653. Because he had changed directions, he passed by a large river this time. Every realm and every continent had different terrains and landforms. However, there was one thing that was common: one or more mother rivers. In small places, there were small rivers that converged into large rivers that flowed down and nurtured countless humans and mortals. Water was the most basic condition for the birth of life. It was the same everywhere. Therefore, the dragon god culture that controlled rivers was the most common phenomenon in the universe. Of course, the land of exile also had a mother river named Jiangshangjiang. Just by hearing the name, one would know its position in the land of exile. In the entire land of exile, countless streams converged to form small rivers. The small rivers converged to form tributaries, and the tributaries converged to form regional rivers. In the end, it formed the large river that flowed through the land of exile. It was the only mother river that was recognized by everyone, Jiangshangjiang. Jiangshangjiang ran from the north to the south of the land of exile. It was tens of thousands of miles long, winding and surging. Along the way, it left behind countless beautiful sceneries. There were all kinds of large waterfalls, giant lakes, and dangerous valleys. Some were magnificent, some were elegant, some were gentle, some were turbulent. The refugees were often proud. Half of the 100 sceneries of the land of exile were on the river. From this, one could see how important Jiang was in the land of exile. Lu Xiaoyi had flown in the wrong direction the last time, so he did not have the chance to see this great river. This time, he was lucky. He happened to be traveling along the river. While admiring the beautiful sceneries along the way, he also found a very strange place. Looking down from the sky, there was a section of Jiang that was tens of thousands of miles long. It was about 3,000 miles long. Countless people gathered on both sides of the river. Even if they were scattered across the 3,000 miles long river, he estimated that there were at least millions of people gathered there. It was hard to imagine that there would be such a large-scale gathering in the mortal world. Fortunately, it was spread out so that there would not be any disorderly stampedes. The largest number of people were gathered at the two ends of the river. There were hundreds of thousands of people at a certain part of the river downstream, and hundreds of thousands of people at a certain part of the river upstream. Furthermore, the number of people was still continuously converging. What was going on? Lu Xiaoyi was interested. I don't want to go. I have to stay on the boat for a few days, and there are so many boring people watching. It feels so strange. Huang Xiaoya turned her head and once again rejected her mother's persuasion. She was a budding girl, the most beautiful period of her life. There were too many fun things waiting for her, and there was also a better future calling out to her. Things like dragon boat racing were fine for her, but she was not willing to go into the real boat race. The beautiful woman sighed and took out her trump card. Yeah, if you don't listen to me, when your grandfather comes, it won't be up to you anymore. You'll have to eat first. Huang Xiaoya turned around in a fit of pique, pretending not to hear. Of course she wasn't called Huang Xiaoya, that was just her nickname. Her real name was Huang Xiaoya, and it was a name given to her by her grandfather. Whether it was her real name or her nickname, she didn't like it. But there was nothing he could do. In this clan, his grandfather was the heavens. His words carried enormous weight, and no one dared to question him. She also knew that in the end, she couldn't go against her family's wishes. In fact, it was also her grandfather's wishes. However, as an adult, she felt that she had the right to express herself, even if the end result was still obedience. What she didn't want to go to was the once-in-a-decade dragon boat race in the land of exile. This was not a small event, but the only festival in the entire land of exile where all the people participated, where cultivators and mortals celebrated and enjoyed both refined and common tastes. It was known as the Dragon God Festival, and the most important, most spectacular, most intense, and most beautiful event was the dragon boat race. Cut off the middle section of the river, 3,000 miles long. Each dragon boat set off from the downstream and went against the current, competing to see which dragon boat could reach the finish line first. The rules were very simple. With such a big scene and so many onlookers, of course, the simpler the better. If it was too complicated, it would lose its interest. Standing on both sides of the river, surrounded by crowds of onlookers, cheering for their favorite dragon boat, releasing their emotions, relieving their pressure, and enjoying the once-in-a-decade relaxation was the most important festival in the lives of the local natives. When did this festival start? It had been too long, and there was no way to investigate. However, there was a clear division among the participants. In the early days of the dragon boat race, the participants were basically ordinary mortals. Tens of thousands of years ago, because of the gradual promotion of cultivation in the land of exile, more people became aware of it, so the dragon boat race also began to become a festival for cultivators and mortals to enjoy together. This was a very common thing in the world of cultivation. There were no countries in the land of exile, and each city was autonomous. The rulers were cultivators, so it was only natural that the dragon boat race eventually evolved into a competition for cultivators. On the contrary, it was more fun. How many miles could ordinary mortals row in the water? 10 miles would be exhausting, and 20 miles was a big hurdle, and this was under the condition that they were going down the river. The once-in-a-decade festival ended in a few hours. It was too disappointing to lose interest just as it started. Moreover, the distance was too short, and it couldn't accommodate too many onlookers. The participation of cultivators fundamentally changed this situation. 100 miles, 1,000 miles, until now, 3,000 miles. It was still going against the current. The fastest dragon boat in history took 5 days to go against the current of 3,000 miles. Of course, this time was not the time for Foundation Establishment Jean Dan cultivators to row. If there were 20 Luxiai on the dragon boat, it might only take 2 hours? They couldn't row too fast, because it was easy to fly. If there were 20 Foundation Establishment cultivators, it would be over in a day. There was no appreciation, fun, or linkage. After all, this was a festival that both cultivators and mortals used to have. The rowers were all chi cultivators. Only they could perfectly combine competition and appreciation. For a few days they didn't have to think about the problems of rest, urination, food supply, physical exhaustion, wind and rain. They couldn't fly, so they could only work hard to row. In 5 to 10 days they could row across the 3,000 miles of the river to satisfy the longing of the people along the coast who had been waiting for 10 years. It was good. Mortals celebrated the festival on the shore, bought and sold, held a lantern festival, had delicious food, juggling, romance, literary gatherings, and a series of hodgepodge, and then waited for the high tide of the dragon boat crossing. This was a true grand event. The 3,000 miles of river could allow more cities to participate. The merchants had long set up sheds, tents, and stages on both sides of the river for the consumption of the people. This was also their festival. The short Dragon God festival was less than a month, but they could earn at least 1 or 2 years' worth of profits. Of course, it didn't matter if they couldn't afford it. They could squat on the strange rocks and steep slopes on both sides of the river and watch the excitement of the dragon boat race. Those places with all kinds of entertainment facilities were left to the city people and the rich. There were more than 100 such viewing platforms on both sides of the river. Every city had its own location. Of course, every city also had its own dragon boat. Chapter 654. Because it was an event of the entire land of exile, there were many parties participating. Basically, every big city would send its own team with its own flag. Powerful small and medium-sized cities would also join in the fun. After all, it was not difficult to find 20 outstanding chi cultivators on this continent. It was basically impossible for them to find 20 golden core cultivators in a city. If they found 20 Foundation Establishment cultivators, their strength would also be uneven. However, if they were to find 20 Chi Refinement warriors, it would be very fair because almost all of them were at the peak of Chi Refinement realm, and were preparing to build their Tao foundation. It was also because of this that they steered the boats, implying that they were like carps leaping over the Dragon Gate. It was a good omen. It was not only divided by region, but also by force. Large and small sects, including the heaven-defying sect in the land of exile, would send their own teams, because it was said that if they could get a good ranking in the top 10 in the dragon boat competition, they would be favored by the dragon god. Of course, only God knew whether it was true or not. In this way, the number of dragon boats participating in the Dragon Boat Conference was not small. It was not a scale that a dozen broken boats in the countryside could compare to. Generally, the number could be maintained at 300 to 400, and there was an increase or decrease in each realm. It was not fixed, and there was no threshold. As long as you could gather together a majestic dragon boat and gather 20 chi refining cultivators, you could participate. No one was rejected. It was also because of this scale that the starting point of the competition was deliberately chosen to be a short, wide, and gentle river. On the river, hundreds of dragon boats were lined up in a row. It was very fair. Moreover, on the river for the next 100 miles, it was all flat and wide, which was conducive to the competition of the dragon boats. There would not be too many scrapes and collisions. In the next 2,000 miles, they would encounter all kinds of complicated water conditions. In the combination of forces, there was a loose force, which was the Xianyuan swordsmen from the main world. Because of the rules of the sect, they could not establish a sect here. Since they came here to retire, of course, they would not live in a group. They all lived separately, scattered on the vast continent of the land of exile. As the saying goes, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Since they were here, of course, it was impossible for them to cut themselves off from the local customs. They could turn a blind eye to some small activities, but for a grand event like the Dragon Boat Conference, they must attend. Not only did they have to participate, but they also had to get into the top 10 in order to show the prestige of the upper realm. Huang Xiaoya was born into a swordsman family. Her grandfather was a foundation establishment swordsman from Qingkong, and he was lucky enough to achieve a fake Dan stage here. He also stole a few hundred years of lifespan, so he started to blossom and grow leaves here, establishing a family. There were many people like their Huang family in the exile area, and they could be considered as the true second or third generation of cultivators. Every time the 10-year period of the Dragon Boat Conference arrived, the swordsman families of the Shao Mountain would contact each other and arrange some of their children to participate in the competition. However, trees have shade and leaves, and people have a cycle of prosperity and decline. Although 20 qi cultivation spots were not many, sometimes it was hard to get together. For example, some families did not inherit well, or for some other reasons, it was difficult to find a cultivator at the peak of qi cultivation in his prime. The people of Xianyuan Kingdom cared a lot about their reputation, especially in the land of exile. The upper realm was very arrogant, so they had to send young people to maintain their reputation. If they were to send 20 white-bearded old men who had not been able to build their foundation for decades, they would not look good either. Before the competition, their momentum was weak. Just like this time, finding 20 young people at the peak of qi cultivation was a little difficult. The Xianyuan people could not find outsiders to replace them, so they expanded the scope and allowed women to participate this time. In the past, few women participated. It was not that they discriminated against women, but in an occasion like the Dragon Boat competition, the qi cultivators did not have magical power. After fighting in the water for several days, they were soaked and their hair would be exposed. It did not matter to the men, as long as they were naked, but what about the women? When the river water was wet, the curves were exposed, and they had to paddle hard. The rising and falling, shaking and swaying style was what the mortals on the shore liked to see the most. There were all kinds of comments, countless nitpicking, and those with tender faces could not stand it. This was the main reason why Huang Xiao was not willing to go. But this was not something she could decide. A majestic voice came down. There are still 5 days before the Dragon Boat Conference begins. You set off tomorrow with your aunt. Don't do anything on the way. You must arrive before the conference begins. If you ruin the reputation of the Huang family, be careful of your skin. Huang Xiao was a delicate princess in the Huang family's mansion. No one dared to go against her wishes. Only her grandfather was serious. When he disciplined her, he really did not care about the difference between men and women. If he said he would beat her, he would really beat her. He was also the only person she was afraid of. She could only pout and agree. Her resistance failed. Calling her aunt was not to accompany her to play, but to monitor her. This aunt was a figure who had built the Taoist foundation. Although she built the Taoist foundation in the exile, the Taoist foundation was still the Taoist foundation. It was not a problem to control her. The ant water fairy floated in and took out a black leather suit with a smile. It was a survival item for fishermen who relied on water to make a living. Xia, look at what I brought you. I guarantee that it is sturdy and durable, and it will not show any style. The two got up early the next day and rode fast. In fact, with their residence, it was still very close to the starting point of the Dragon Boat Conference. 3 days was enough. If it was not possible, her aunt could take her to fly for a while. Grandfather asked her to come early because he was afraid that she would drag on the road and deliberately cause trouble. Although the rule was that there were 20 people on a dragon boat, it did not matter if there were more or less. Therefore, if she did not go alone, it might not affect the sailing of the boat. However, it was hard to say whether she could win the top 10 in the end. After all, they were all chi cultivators. The means of cultivators were very limited. One less person would slowly show the gap between 3,000 miles and a few days. Huang Xiya did not like that water suit. It might protect her from being exposed, but in a sense, it would make the curves of her body more conspicuous. In front of the Taoist Foundation, she could not escape. Moreover, if the failure of the Dragon Boat Conference was caused by her, her grandfather would personally catch her and take her back to teach her a lesson. She was very sure that her grandfather would not be soft-hearted just because she was a girl. In many remote areas of the exile, because of the local customs and habits, the local women did not care too much about this. Even some minority groups took appropriate exposure as a style, such as her widowed aunt. But she was different. She had received the most standard education since she was a child, but she was not willing to accept paddling under the comments of millions of people in the next few days. The problem was, how to get rid of it. How to find a foolproof plan. Chapter 655. Huang Xiaoyan knew that she only had one chance. She would rather risk her grandfather's punishment and stick to her bottom line. She was a swordsman. Of course, she was not now, but she would definitely be in the future. Since she was a swordsman, she should always stick to her own will and not be swayed by others, even if it was her own grandfather. She could not persist at home, because the old man had countless ways to deal with her. Her chance was right outside, on the way out with her aunt. Huang Xiya was very depressed. The dragon boat competition this time came too suddenly. If she had known that there would be such a calamity, she would have avoided it long ago. No matter how difficult the swordsman team was, they could still find a replacement. Unfortunately, the news came in a hurry, and her grandfather did not care about her feelings at all. He patted his chest and promised the Huang clan to produce a chi refinement warrior. In the end, she was trapped inside. Even if she wanted to run, how could it be too late? But a chi refinement warrior, under the care of a foundation establishment cultivator, how many chances would there be? Galloping all the way, no accidents happened. During the Dragon God Festival, everyone's temper was exceptionally good. Even if Huang Xiuya tried several times without leaving a trace, such as charging her horse into others, knocking over roadside vendors, and quarreling with others, she could not get rid of her aunt's meaningful surveillance. She knew that she could not go too far. If she went too far, she would really be dragged to the registration area by her aunt. At that time, she would have no chance at all. Huang Xiuya placed her hopes on the place where the dragon boat set off, because there were enough people there and enough opportunities. The gathering of hundreds of thousands of people was not something that a foundation establishment cultivator could fully monitor. This was her last chance. No matter whether the opportunity was good or not, she would take action. She could not wait any longer. The heavens were like this. When there was plenty of time along the way, the heavens did not give her a chance. But when she decided to take advantage of the crowd to forcefully escape at the scene of the competition, the opportunity quietly came. Because she had her own thoughts and intentions, Huang Xiaoya paid special attention to the people she met along the way, especially the cultivators. Her thoughts were very simple. Only by extorting money from cultivators could she create a real dispute and create an opportunity to escape. However, her efforts along the way had disappointed her. First, there were very few cultivators among the mortals. Second, when the other cultivators saw the small flying sword on the ant's robe behind her, they immediately retreated from the resentment they had. In the land of exile, at least on the surface, no one dared to challenge the swordsman from the autonomous world. They had been taught too many lessons, and tens of thousands of years were enough to teach them something. But this time, she made a new discovery. It was a young man who was drinking in a shed by the roadside. He sat alone and wore the most common clothes in the land of exile. Although he had a sunny appearance, and eyes that shone like stars, he still could not be called a crane in a flock of chickens. He blended into the sea of people and blended into the crowd. She noticed two things. One was the hair. The style of hairstyle in the land of exile was not much different from that of the main world. It was all about growing hair, and depending on the environment and the occasion, one's status would determine whether it was a tall hat, a Taoist hat, a small hat, a small hat, a hat, and so on. This person did not wear a hat. His long hair was simply tied up with a hairpin and draped over his shoulders. It was the most common hairstyle for scholars and talented people. It was chic and unruly. In this Dragon God festival, men dressed like this could be found everywhere, so it was not surprising. The difference was in the quality of the hair. Ordinary mortals would walk for several days and their hair would be covered in oil, dandruff, and dust. No matter how diligent they were in taking care of it, it would still be distinguishable at a glance. It was not as good as cultivators who could control their bodily functions, always keeping their hair smooth and flowing with the wind. Looking at the quality of this person's hair, it was clear that he was a cultivator. His realm was unknown, but from his aura, it was likely that he was a chi cultivator like her. The hairpin was inserted diagonally, not upright as it was under normal circumstances. The result of this insertion method was that the hair was not draped over the back, but fell over the left and right shoulders. The reason why Huang Xuya paid attention to this point was because she had only seen this hairpin insertion method on her grandfather. There was also once when her grandfather was in a good mood at a family gathering and asked about it. Only then did she know that this insertion method was to ensure that the hair would not be cut off by the flying sword when the sword case was unsheathed. Therefore, it had to be inserted diagonally, letting the hair fall over the left and right shoulders. This was a habit. Although it was inadvertent, for an intelligent woman like her, it was not difficult to find out as long as she paid attention. Could it be that he was also a swordsman she cultivator who came to participate in the dragon boat race? She was not completely sure, but there was always a possibility. Would she get pregnant if she asked? "Brother, are you a fellow cultivator who came to participate in the dragon boat race?" This little girl pays her respects. Lu Xiaoyi turned his head and a young woman with bright eyes appeared in his line of sight. She was in the bud and was in the prime of her youth. However, there was obviously an elder behind her that caught his eye. As she walked, she swayed and swayed gracefully, her waves surging. "Not really. I just came to take a look and feel it. Well, with my cultivation, I may not meet the requirements of the competition." Lu Xiaoyi really came to watch the fun. With his cultivation, he could actually hide in the sky and look down. It was more panoramic, but he lost the feeling of the atmosphere. If he flew at a low altitude, was he looking at the dragon boat? Or was the audience looking at him? Therefore, he simply landed far away and walked on foot. Being in touch with the mortal world, he could also adjust his mood. He was not worried about being discovered by others, so he put away the sword case. As for the aura of his cultivation, he had now made progress in the cultivation method of the stars. He began to understand an additional ability of the cultivation method of the stars, the silence of the stars. This was the ability to disperse one's aura to the stars that one had comprehended. Now, he had comprehended close to 2,000 stars. Therefore, when his aura was spread out through the 2,000 stars, he would reach the level of a chi refinement warrior below the foundation establishment. This was the aura concealment technique, which was much more advanced than the spirit concealment technique. It was not deliberate at all, but natural. Only a top-notch technique like the Big Dipper scripture could do it. He was not lying when he said that he did not meet the requirements of the competition. Of course, a Jean Dan could not participate in the activities of a chi cultivator. Wasn't this bullying? However, Huang Xiaoye had obviously misunderstood. She had a preconceived notion that this person was a chi cultivator. Perhaps he had not reached the peak of chi cultivator? What was so important about this? It was not like he was lacking in this little bit. She saw hope, a hope of substituting one thing for another. She still needed to verify it. Brother, are you a swordsman? Are you from the main world? These words were very rude, but it also depended on who said it. If it was an innocent girl with bright eyes, then it was fine to be rude, right? Huang Xiaoye was very good at making use of her assets. Her eyes and frown had the innocence of a young girl. This was also her goal. If she did not want to be seen by millions of people, then it was not bad to sacrifice a little for the person in front of her. Anyway, this person was not bad, so she would not lose out. Chapter 656. Lu Xiaoyu was gentle and refined. He had this foundation. He came from a big family, so there was no need to pretend. Especially in front of these two beauties, one had been touched by a pig, and the other had not. He was a kind person. Oh? How did you find out, miss? Is my performance very obvious? Huang Xiaoye smiled but did not answer. Her face was full of pride, but Daffodil Luoluo Dafa came over to greet him. She was a foundation establishment cultivator, and considered herself an elder, but Lu Xiaoyu would not call her aunt. In terms of age, they had to call him great-grandfather. In the cultivation world, age was not the only thing that mattered. The more one talked about it, the more chaotic it became. I see that little brother is not far from the peak of qi refining. You also have the qualifications to participate. Young people should be brave enough to hit the water. Why did you abandon the boat and not fight? Which family are you from? Tell me, maybe I know your elders. How could Lu Xiaoyu know the real situation of the nearby swordsman family? There was no way to make up a lie. If she casually asked for a person's name, he would be exposed, so he simply shut up and laughed. Huang Xiaoye immediately found the problem with her unique way of thinking. You didn't hide because you didn't want to participate in the dragon boat race, did you? I knew it was like this. Otherwise, with so many swordsman families, how could it be my turn to stand out? This is not fair. Lu Xiaoyu found that women were not scary when they talked to themselves. What was scary was that they wanted to prove themselves. He did not say anything, but the two women had already filled in his background, experience, reason, purpose, and so on. It was really others who said things about him that made him speechless. He still did not understand the purpose of the two women. It might be a misunderstanding. Maybe the girl was complaining that she did not want to participate in such a boat race, but this had nothing to do with him. It was best if the girl went to row the boat. He could also get closer to her aunt, therefore, he did not refute, but only laughed, which made Huang Xiaoye even more certain. However, she was from a swordsman family, so she still had the minimum vigilance. Let me see your sword talisman. Half coquettish, half threatening. You can't just show it to anyone. Lu Xiaoyu was afraid that taking it out would scare them, because his sword talisman was a Xianyuan core disciple's sword talisman, which was unique to the sword Qi Rushing Heaven Pavilion. It was not the same as the ordinary Xianyuan sword talisman. He was afraid that once he took it out, he would expose himself and lose this beautiful misunderstanding. He would become an elder and lose the fun. In order to show fairness, she first took out her own sword talisman, and then forced her aunt to take out her sword talisman. When Lu Xiaoyu saw this, he almost laughed out loud. They were simply two fakes, probably made by the Huang family herself. There was a trace of the Huang family sword aura on it, and it could only be used to scare people in the land of exile. Perhaps it was recognized by the swordsman families here, but in the main world, it was nothing. If you don't take it out, I'll punish you for impersonating a Xianyuan swordsman. Failing to seduce him, Huang Xiaoya immediately changed it to a threat. Lu Xiaoyi didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but he couldn't be angry. After all, she only wanted to form a good relationship with him, so he had no choice but to take out his sword talisman and flash it. He even deliberately concealed the aura within it. Of course, the aura of the sword talisman couldn't be hidden, so the two women confirmed his identity. However, Huang Xiaoya was very unconvinced. Eh? Why is your sword talisman so exquisite? Its aura is also much stronger. No, when I go back, I have to ask Grandpa to make me another one. Seeing that the two women were indifferent to the sword talisman, Lu Xiaoyi immediately understood where the problem was. These two wooden hammers must have never seen the real Xianyuan sword talisman, so they were completely unable to understand the truth. It was understandable that they had stayed in the land of exile for their entire lives, and their family lived alone, so how could there be an atmosphere of the sword vein? He didn't say anything, and only said a few words. Maybe the sword talisman of a male is more exquisite? It would have been better if Huang Xiaoya didn't hear this, but after hearing this, she became angry. Male? What's wrong with a male? The benefits are all yours, but you want us women to row the boat? Yet you came here to hide and relax. Lu Xiaoyi finally understood her intentions, but he couldn't help her with this kind of thing. Hee, when the time comes, I'll wave the flag and cheer for you. Who wants you to cheer for me? Although Huang Xiaoya said that, she immediately had a plan in her heart. There were still 2 days left. Time was a bit tight, but it wasn't completely impossible. She decided to use a beauty trap and encourage this guy to take her place in the boat race. This was the perfect result. She didn't need to personally get on the boat, and her grandfather wouldn't blame her. It was the best of both worlds. A beauty trap was not very useful for cultivators, especially for cultivators with higher realms. If a mere woman could tempt them, then this Tao could be considered a dog's body. But at lower realms, it was different. For example, Foundation establishment cultivators had the need to become Tao companions, so their resistance to this aspect was weaker. Even Foundation establishment cultivators were like this, not to mention Qi refinement warriors. Strictly speaking, Qi refinement warriors were not cultivators at all. They didn't even have magic power. They were in a state where their bodies were becoming stronger, but their minds had not yet caught up. This was a transitional stage between cultivators and mortals, and it was especially easy for them to be tempted by women. There were still 3 days left, and Huang Xiaoya felt that she could do it. Since everyone is of the same bloodline, then let's go together. We can also take care of each other. Lu Xiaoyi gladly accepted the order. Having a beauty with him was much more interesting than being alone. But after only 1 day, Huang Xiaoya knew that her plan might not work. Love was a woman's talent, and they had a natural desire to perform. Jealousy was also a woman's specialty, and they had a terrifying intuition about it. In just 1 day, Huang Xiaoya felt that this guy who came from an unknown family was very perverted. He actually looked at her aunt more than her. I treat you as a friend, and you actually want to be my uncle? She decided to change her plan. Although she was a little disappointed, she had a big goal. She also wanted to go further on the path of cultivation, so she was very resistant to marriage. Her family always gave her pressure in this aspect, but she had her grandfather to support her, so she was not afraid of anyone. This was the only thing that satisfied her about the old man from the Huang family. Since she wasn't attractive enough, then she could only persuade her aunt to do it. But although her aunt doted on her, she couldn't possibly give her body for this, right? She also wouldn't push her family into the arms of others for her own reasons. Luckily, it was just alone. Aunt Water Immortal was a Foundation establishment cultivator, so why would she be afraid of this perverted guy doing something bad? She needed to set up a trap, a simple one. It would give her a chance to escape, and at the same time, because her aunt had this brat as a scapegoat, she wouldn't specially come after her. Huang Xiaoyao's little brain started to work, and she carefully calculated, "You're tuning into the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories."